Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. I'm glad you're here, wherever you happen to be listening from, settling into this moment, letting the day loosen its grip just a little. If you find this kind of quiet exploration soothing, if these slow journeys into the distant past help you unwind, you can like the video or subscribe in your own time. There's no rush. This space is meant to feel unhurried. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with a question that sounds dramatic at first but becomes strangely ordinary the longer we sit with it. We're not talking about fire from the sky, or beings descending in flashes of light, or sudden moments of creation that transform the world in an instant. Instead, we're looking at something far quieter, far more grounded, and in many ways far more unsettling. We're looking at what the Sumerian tablets actually describe when they speak about the Anunnaki living on Earth. Not ruling from unreachable heights, not appearing only in visions or cataclysms, but existing here day after day, within a functioning world that already had rhythms, routines, and expectations. The Sumerian texts, when read slowly and without the assumptions modern storytelling often brings with it, do not present the Anunnaki as constant arrivals or dramatic intruders. They appear already present. They are named within an environment that is already structured. Cities exist, fields are irrigated, temples are maintained, time is being counted, work is being done. The tablets do not pause to explain how the Anunnaki entered this world, because by the time the scribes are writing, entry is no longer the point. Presence is. This is an important shift in perspective. Modern interpretations often focus obsessively on beginnings, on arrivals, on origins that feel cinematic and decisive. The Sumerian record is different. It is administrative, ritual, genealogical, practical. It describes relationships, responsibilities, roles, and limitations. It describes a world in which the Anunnaki are embedded into daily reality, not hovering above it. And when we pay attention to that tone, something subtle emerges. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the tablets, live lives shaped by repetition, obligation, and constraint. The earliest layers of Sumerian writing do not read like myths in the modern sense. They read like memory systems, lists of gods, assignments of domains, descriptions of who is responsible for what, who resides where, who oversees which function of the world. This is not storytelling designed to entertain. It is recording designed to stabilize a worldview. Within that worldview, the Anunnaki are not omnipresent abstractions. They occupy space. They have locations. They dwell in temples, in cities, in specific regions tied to rivers, plains, and human settlement. The texts do not describe the Anunnaki as existing outside time. They are counted across generations. They age in relation to events. They respond to changes in the world around them. Their authority is real, but it is not limitless. It operates within systems. It requires maintenance. It requires presence. This alone tells us something essential about their daily existence. Whatever the Anunnaki were understood to be, they were not imagined as beings who could simply will reality into compliance without effort. They participate. Participation implies routine, and routine implies a kind of life that unfolds not in moments of spectacle, but in sequences of ordinary actions. The tablets hint at this through what they emphasize, and just as importantly, through what they do not emphasize. There are no constant miracles recorded. There is no endless intervention. Instead, there is management, oversight, decision-making, arbitration, allocation of resources. The Anunnaki appear as figures who attend assemblies, who receive offerings at regular intervals, who are invoked according to calendars rather than emergencies. In Sumerian temples, daily rituals were not performed sporadically. They followed schedules. Offerings were prepared at set times. Hymns were recited according to tradition. Food was presented, not as symbolic gestures alone, but as part of a reciprocal system. The gods received sustenance, and in return they upheld order. This arrangement only makes sense if the gods were believed to be present in a way that required consistency. You do not feed what is never there. You do not maintain what does not remain. The Anunnaki, in particular, are described as a collective with defined roles. They are not interchangeable. Each has a domain, a responsibility, a sphere of influence that requires attention. Some are associated with judgment, others with fertility, others with boundaries between realms. These responsibilities do not vanish between dramatic events. They persist. They require daily attention. The texts reflect this through their calm tone. Nothing about this system feels hurried. It feels established. When scribes copied these tablets, they were not inventing these structures. They were preserving them, and preservation suggests longevity. A system that lasts long enough to be worth recording is not one built on constant disruption. It is one built on habit, on repetition, on routines that become invisible because they work. This is where the modern imagination often struggles. We expect gods to be extraordinary in every moment. The Sumerian worldview does not require that. Divinity is not defined by constant spectacle. It is defined by function. A god who maintains order quietly is no less divine than one who destroys cities. In fact, within this system, quiet maintenance may be more important. The world does not collapse because the Anunnaki are not always acting. It holds together because they are always present. Presence, however, comes with cost. The tablets occasionally hint at strain, at fatigue, at dissatisfaction, at moments where the gods express frustration with the burdens placed upon them. This suggests that their daily existence was not effortless. It required endurance. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as immune to weariness. They complain, they negotiate, they seek relief from labour. This is not metaphorical language alone. It reflects a worldview in which even divine beings are embedded in systems that demand energy. The daily life of the Anunnaki, as implied by these texts, unfolds within a world that already knows morning and evening, work and rest, obligation and reprieve. They attend to their domains much as human administrators attend to theirs, though on a different scale. They receive reports, they make decisions, they enforce boundaries, they uphold laws that are older than the cities themselves. What is striking is how rarely the texts pause to marvel at this arrangement. The Anunnaki's presence is treated as normal, expected, integrated. This tells us that for the Sumerians the extraordinary was not that gods lived among the structures of the world, but that order could be maintained at all. The daily life of the Anunnaki is not highlighted because it is sensational. It is recorded because it is necessary. As we move forward, we will stay close to this tone. We will follow what the tablets emphasize rather than what later interpretations project onto them. We will look at how the Anunnaki are situated within cities, within temples, within calendars, within systems of work and rest. We will look at what it means to live somewhere long enough that presence becomes responsibility, and responsibility becomes burden. Nothing here requires sudden conclusions. The picture builds slowly, one routine at a time, one obligation layered on top of another. The world of the Anunnaki is not a place of constant arrival or departure. It is a place of staying, and staying changes what power looks like. The story does not begin with thunder or light. It begins with continuity, and from that continuity everything else follows. When we turn to the Sumerian tablets with patience rather than expectation, one of the first things that becomes apparent is what they do not say. There are no detailed accounts of arrival, no descriptions of descent, no emphasis on entry, landing, or first contact. This absence is not accidental, and it is not a gap created by damage or loss alone. It reflects something much deeper in how the scribes understood the presence of the Anunnaki in the world they described. By the time writing begins, by the time the tablets are being impressed with signs meant to endure, the Anunnaki are already there. The texts do not introduce them as newcomers. They are not framed as strangers adjusting to an unfamiliar environment. They are named as part of an existing order, woven into a reality that already functions. This matters because ancient texts are rarely casual with what they include or omit. When a culture chooses not to describe an arrival, it is often because arrival is not the defining feature. What matters instead is duration, continuity, staying. In the Sumerian worldview, existence is layered. There is a time before structure, a time of formation, and then a time of order. The Anunnaki belong to that ordered phase. They are not associated with the chaotic beginnings of existence, nor are they tied to a sudden intervention that disrupts an established world. They appear after structure is in place, after heaven and earth have been separated, after cycles of time are functioning. This placement alone tells us that their role is not to initiate reality, but to inhabit it. When the tablets mention the Anunnaki, they do so in a matter-of-fact way. Their names appear in lists, in legal formulas, in hymns, in ritual instructions. There is no sense that their presence requires explanation. A scribe does not pause to clarify who they are or where they came from, because the intended audience already understands this. The Anunnaki are part of the landscape of meaning, as familiar as rivers, fields, or temples. This familiarity is reinforced by how they are located. The texts associate gods with specific cities, specific sanctuaries, specific regions. A god resides somewhere. A god has a seat. A god receives offerings at a particular place, at particular times. These are not the behaviours of beings imagined as transient visitors. They are the behaviours of residents, of entities whose authority is tied to place rather than movement. The Sumerian language itself supports this interpretation. Verbs associated with the gods often imply dwelling, standing, presiding, or remaining. They do not emphasize coming and going. When movement is described, it is usually within the world, between cities or realms, not between worlds. The Anunnaki travel, but they do not arrive. They withdraw, but they do not depart in the way a visitor leaves. These distinctions may seem subtle, but in a text-based culture that encoded meaning carefully, they are significant. To understand why this matters, it helps to consider what arrival narratives usually accomplish. Arrival establishes difference. It marks a boundary between before and after. It explains disruption. The Sumerian texts do not frame the Anunnaki as disruptive in this way. Their presence does not inaugurate chaos or transformation. Instead, they operate within an already functioning system. Their authority is exercised through maintenance rather than conquest. This becomes clearer when we look at the administrative nature of many tablets, lists of offerings, distributions of labour, assignments of responsibility. The gods are woven into these systems as overseers and beneficiaries, not as external forces imposing themselves. A visitor changes a household by their presence. A resident defines the household by remaining. The absence of arrival stories also shapes how time is understood. The Sumerians did not conceive of history as a linear progression punctuated by dramatic interventions. They thought in terms of cycles, continuities, and renewals. The Anunnaki belong to a cycle that is already turning. They are not the spark that starts it spinning. They are the weight that keeps it steady. This is why the texts focus so much on what the gods do rather than how they got there. Duties matter more than origins. Responsibilities matter more than beginnings. In this worldview, power is not validated by dramatic entrance, but by sustained presence. A god proves authority not by appearing, but by remaining effective over time. This perspective also explains why later traditions that emphasize descent or arrival feel out of place when read against the earliest tablets. Those later narratives reflect different concerns, different audiences, different symbolic needs. The Sumerian scribes who compiled god lists and temple hymns were not interested in spectacle. They were interested in stability. Their world depended on predictable floods, predictable seasons, predictable divine favour. A god who suddenly arrives is unpredictable. A god who stays can be negotiated with. Negotiation is a key concept here. The relationship between humans and gods in Sumerian thought is reciprocal. Humans provide labour, offerings, maintenance of temples. Gods provide order, fertility, protection. This relationship only functions if both sides are present over time. You cannot negotiate with someone who is passing through. You negotiate with someone who remains. The Anunnaki in particular are often associated with judgment, fate and decree. These functions require continuity. A judge who appears only briefly cannot establish precedent. A being who determines fate must be present across generations to see outcomes unfold. The tablets reflect this by situating the Anunnaki within long spans of time. They are not fleeting, they endure. There are moments in the texts where gods express dissatisfaction with their roles, where they complain about burdens or seek relief. These moments are revealing, because they assume duration. One does not grow weary of a short visit. Fatigue accumulates through staying, through repeated obligation. The very fact that gods can be described as tired tells us that their presence is ongoing rather than episodic. This sense of ongoing residence is also reflected in temple architecture. Temples were not built as temporary shrines. They were massive layered structures, rebuilt again and again on the same sacred footprint. Each rebuild assumed that the god had not left. The structure might decay, be destroyed, or be renovated, but the divine resident remained attached to the place. The Anunnaki in this context are anchored to the world through architecture, ritual and memory. It is also important to notice how rarely the texts imagine a world without the gods. Even in moments of catastrophe, such as floods or destruction, the gods do not vanish. They withdraw, they observe, they judge, but they remain part of the system. A visitor might leave when conditions worsen. A resident endures the consequences of the world they inhabit. The modern tendency to read the Anunnaki as visitors often says more about modern concerns than ancient ones. We live in a culture fascinated by contact, arrival and the unknown. The Sumerians lived in a culture focused on survival, agriculture and continuity. For them, the question was not who came from where, but who stayed long enough to matter. The tablets reflect this practical orientation. They do not waste space on what does not serve the functioning of the world. Origins are addressed only insofar as they explain current arrangements. Once those arrangements are in place, the focus shifts to maintenance. The Anunnaki are part of that maintenance structure. This does not mean that the Sumerians denied beginnings. They had creation narratives, genealogies, sequences of emergence. But once those narratives have done their work, they recede. The daily reality takes precedence. And in that daily reality, the Anunnaki are already present, already embedded, already involved. By treating the Anunnaki as residents rather than visitors, the tablets normalize their presence. They are not otherworldly in the sense of being disconnected from earthly concerns. They are otherworldly in status, but not in location. They belong to the same structured reality as humans, even if they occupy different roles within it. This framing has important implications for how we understand power. Power that arrives can shock, but power that stays shapes. The Anunnaki shape the world not through constant intervention, but through persistent oversight. Their authority becomes part of the background of existence, so familiar that it rarely needs to be stated outright. As we continue, this sense of residence will deepen. We will see how living somewhere transforms authority into routine, presence into obligation, and power into something that must be managed rather than displayed. The tablets do not describe gods who pass through. They describe gods who remain, and in remaining become part of the fabric of the world they oversee. Nothing here concludes. The picture continues to build, grounded not in dramatic entrances, but in the quiet weight of staying. By the time the Anunnaki are named in the Sumerian tablets, the world they inhabit is already moving. It is not waiting to be set in motion. It does not pause for their appearance. Rivers flow, fields are cultivated, time is measured. Cities stand in ordered relation to one another. This is one of the most easily overlooked but most revealing features of the Sumerian record. The Anunnaki do not inaugurate existence. They enter a narrative that is already underway. The tablets do not begin with them. They are introduced only after a great deal has already been established. Heaven and earth have been separated. The basic architecture of the cosmos is in place. The cycle of day and night is functioning. Seasons are recognized. The language of order precedes the language of divine groups. This sequencing matters because ancient scribes were deliberate in how they organized cosmology. What appears first is what they considered foundational. When we read the earliest cosmogonic material, we encounter primordial forces, abstract principles, and elemental domains before we ever encounter structured divine assemblies. Water precedes sky. Sky precedes air. Air precedes administration. The Anunnaki belong to administration. They are part of a system that assumes the existence of boundaries, roles, and continuity. A system cannot be administered unless it already exists. This is why the Anunnaki are never described as creators of the world itself. They do not separate heaven from earth. They do not bring light into darkness. They do not define the first movements of time. Instead, they appear as inheritors of a world that already has shape. Their authority is not generative, it is regulatory. The tablets reflect this through their tone. There is no sense of novelty when the Anunnaki are mentioned. No explanatory pause, no framing language that introduces them as something unprecedented. They are referenced alongside cities, temples, and rituals as if they are already known quantities. This suggests that the audience for these texts was expected to understand the structure of the world before encountering the Anunnaki by name. This expectation reveals something important about Sumerian thought. The gods were not all equal. They were not introduced simultaneously. They belonged to layers. Some forces were so fundamental that they could not even be personified clearly. Others were given names, genealogies, and responsibilities because the world had become complex enough to require them. The Anunnaki emerge at precisely that point of complexity. Their appearance coincides with a world that needs judgment, allocation, and oversight. Fate must be assigned. Boundaries between realms must be enforced. Death must be regulated. These are not concerns of a newly formed cosmos. They are concerns of a settled one. The fact that the Anunnaki are named only after these systems are in place tells us that their daily existence unfolded within a framework they did not design. They operate inside it. They maintain it. They enforce it. But they did not bring it into being. This distinction challenges modern interpretations that imagine the Anunnaki as prime movers or external engineers. The tablets simply do not support that view. Even language reflects this. When the Anunnaki are referenced, verbs associated with them often involve deciding, decreeing, judging, or assigning. These are verbs of management, not creation. They imply an ongoing process rather than a singular act. Management assumes continuity. Decisions must be revisited. Judgments must be applied consistently. This requires time, presence, and familiarity with the system being governed. The world described in the tablets is not static. It is dynamic, but predictable. Floods come seasonally. Crops grow and fail. Human populations increase. Noise accumulates. These developments are treated as consequences of an already functioning world, not anomalies introduced by divine arrival. The Anunnaki respond to these developments. They do not cause them. This response-based role is crucial. It positions the Anunnaki as reactive, as well as authoritative. They adjust policies. They impose limits. They negotiate outcomes with other gods. None of this makes sense in a world that is still being created. It makes sense only in a world that has existed long enough to develop problems. The tablets also preserve lists of cities that predate many mythological narratives: Eridu, Uruk, Nippur. These places are described as already established centres of activity when divine hierarchies are discussed. Temples are assigned gods, not built for arriving ones. A god does not arrive and then demand a city. A city exists and is placed under divine patronage. This inversion is subtle but important. Patronage implies stewardship over something already present. It does not imply authorship. The Anunnaki participate in a system where cities, Humans and institutions have their own inertia. Divine authority does not erase that inertia. It works with it. The Sumerian king list reinforces this perspective. Kingship is said to descend from heaven, but it descends into cities that already exist. The list does not begin with gods ruling an empty land. It begins with rulers governing places. These places are named as if their existence is taken for granted. Again, the world precedes the narrative focus. This tells us something about how the Sumerians understood time. They did not see history as starting from nothing. They saw it as emerging from layers of memory. Each layer builds on the previous one. By the time names matter, structures matter too. The Anunnaki belong to a layer where names and structures are essential. The daily life implied by this arrangement is not one of constant invention. It is one of maintenance. The Anunnaki attend councils, they deliberate, they uphold decrees, they oversee domains that already operate according to established patterns. Their work is not to create rivers, but to ensure rivers behave, not to invent death, but to regulate its consequences. Even conflict among the gods reflects this settled world. Disagreements arise over policy, not over existence. One god argues for humanity's destruction. Another argues for restraint. These debates presuppose a shared understanding of how the world works and what is at stake. They are arguments within a system, not arguments about whether the system should exist. The presence of law in Sumerian culture further supports this interpretation. Law codes, contracts, oaths, and rituals all assume a stable world where actions have predictable consequences. The gods are invoked as witnesses and enforcers of these laws. This role requires consistency. A god who enters a world suddenly would lack the historical continuity to enforce precedent. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are deeply tied to precedent. The underworld provides another example. It is not described as a new invention when the Anunnaki appear. It is already there. It has rules. It has gates. It has procedures. The Anunnaki function as judges within that realm. Judgment presupposes an existing moral and cosmic framework. You cannot judge without standards, though standards must already exist. This framing also explains why the Anunnaki are often portrayed as less visible than other gods. They are not associated with daily phenomena like sunlight or rainfall. They operate behind the scenes. Their work is not immediately observable, but its effects are enduring. This kind of influence is characteristic of a world that runs continuously, not one that resets with each divine action. The fact that the tablets do not dramatize the naming of the Anunnaki further underscores their embeddedness. Names appear quietly, often in lists or formulaic phrases. This is not the language of revelation. It is the language of record-keeping. The scribes are cataloguing an existing order, not announcing a new one. This cataloguing impulse is telling. Sumerian culture valued lists, lists of gods, lists of professions, lists of offerings, lists of cities. Lists imply stability. You do not list what changes constantly. The Anunnaki appear in lists because they are stable components of the world. Their daily existence is predictable enough to be recorded. Predictability does not mean simplicity. The world is complex, layered, and occasionally volatile, but it operates within understood parameters. The Anunnaki's role is to keep those parameters from collapsing. Their authority is exercised through continuity rather than intervention. This perspective also reshapes how we think about divine presence. The Anunnaki do not need to be constantly visible to be influential. Their presence is structural. It is felt through the functioning of systems rather than through appearances. This kind of presence is easy to overlook because it does not draw attention to itself. As we move deeper into the tablets, this pattern repeats. The Anunnaki are always arriving late in the narrative sequence. Not late in time, but late in explanation. They are assumed, not introduced. They are referenced, not unveiled. This assumption tells us that the world they inhabit is older than their naming. The daily life implied by this is one of continuity rather than novelty. The Anunnaki wake into a world that already expects them to fulfill roles. They do not discover their environment, they inherit responsibilities. They participate in a rhythm that predates their own prominence. This is a quieter vision of divinity than modern audiences often expect. It lacks spectacle, but it gains depth. The Anunnaki are not defined by a moment of arrival, but by a duration of presence. Their world does not pause when they are named, it continues, because it has always been continuing. Nothing here resolves. The world remains in motion, the Anunnaki remain within it. And as the record unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that living in an already functioning world changes what power looks like, what authority demands, and what daily existence requires, even for gods. When the Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki in relation to the world, they do not place them hovering above it, detached from its physical realities. They place them within it, among walls, courtyards, canals, storerooms, and temples that were built, repaired, expanded, and rebuilt across generations. The Anunnaki are not described as observing human life from unreachable heights. They are described as occupying the same constructed spaces that define civilization itself. This distinction is subtle but decisive. To live above a world is to be insulated from its constraints. To live among structures is to be shaped by them. Structures impose limits. They require maintenance. They deteriorate. They channel movement. They organize daily behavior. The tablets assume that the gods, including the Anunnaki, are subject to these realities, not exempt from them. The built environment of ancient Mesopotamia was not incidental. It was central to survival. Cities were artificial islands carved out of flood-prone plains. Canals had to be dredged constantly to prevent silting. Walls had to be repaired after storms and seasonal wear. Temples rose in layers. Each new level built atop the ruins of the previous one. These were not symbolic constructions alone. They were functional, demanding continuous labour and oversight. When the texts associate gods with these spaces, they do not present the association as metaphorical. A god resides in a temple. A god statue is washed, clothed, fed, and housed. These actions make sense only if the god is understood to be present in a concrete way. Presence, in this context, is spatial. It is tied to rooms, thresholds, storage areas, and courtyards. The Anunnaki, as part of this system, are not imagined as floating abstractions. They are inhabitants. Living among structures also implies exposure to routine. Temples followed daily schedules. Gates were opened and closed. Offerings were prepared and removed. Priests performed tasks according to strict sequences. These routines did not exist for occasional divine appearances. They existed because the divine presence was assumed to be constant. The Anunnaki fit into this rhythm, not as disruptions, but as the reason the rhythm exists. The architecture itself reflects this assumption. Temples were not designed as viewing platforms for distant gods. They were designed as houses. They included storage rooms, kitchens, sleeping areas, and administrative spaces. The language used to describe temples often overlaps with the language used to describe palaces or large households. This overlap is not accidental. The gods were treated as residents, not as visitors who required only symbolic accommodation. This also reshapes how authority is understood. Authority exercised from above is absolute but distant. Authority exercised from within is negotiated daily. The Anunnaki's power, as reflected in the tablets, is not primarily expressed through overwhelming displays. It is expressed through regulation, judgment, and presence within established systems. They preside over assemblies, they receive petitions, they issue decrees that affect life within the city. Being among structures also means being subject to their vulnerabilities. Temples could be damaged, cities could flood, walls could collapse. The texts do not suggest that divine residences were immune to these realities. On the contrary, rituals of repair and purification often follow disasters, implying that divine spaces were affected alongside human ones. The gods do not float above catastrophe. They endure it alongside their cities. This endurance is significant. It suggests that the Anunnaki's daily existence was shaped by the same environmental pressures that shaped human life, even if their responses and capacities differed. Floods disrupt offerings. Drought reduces supplies. Conflict damages temples. These disruptions require divine attention. The gods must be present to respond, to accept appeasement, to restore order. The tablets also preserve records of divine movement that remains entirely terrestrial. Gods travel between cities. They move from temple to temple. They descend into the underworld or ascend to the heavens. But these movements are described as transitions between structured realms, not escapes from structure itself. Even the heavens are imagined architecturally with gates, thresholds, and boundaries. Living among structures also produces familiarity. The Anunnaki are not strangers to the cities they inhabit. They are woven into civic identity. Cities define themselves by their patron deities. Festivals are scheduled according to divine calendars. Laws are sworn in the presence of gods who are believed to be there, within the walls, witnessing oaths. This is not distant oversight. It is embedded authority. This embeddedness creates expectations. A god who lives in a city is expected to protect it. Failure to do so is interpreted as withdrawal, displeasure, or neglect. The tablets often frame disaster not as proof that the gods never lived there, but as proof that they have turned away. Turning away implies prior presence. You cannot withdraw from a place you never inhabited. The Anunnaki in this context are not defined by transcendence alone. They are defined by obligation. To inhabit a structure is to accept responsibility for it. The gods receive offerings because they are expected to reciprocate. Protection, fertility, and stability are not gifts freely given. They are part of an exchange that depends on ongoing cohabitation. This exchange also limits divine behavior. A god who lives among humans must consider human reactions. Anger has consequences. Withdrawal has consequences. The flood narratives make this clear. When gods choose to destroy or abandon cities, the consequences ripple through the divine order as well. The loss of offerings, labour, and maintenance affects the gods themselves. Living among structures binds the divine to the mortal in ways that transcend simple hierarchy. The text also suggests that the Anunnaki are not constantly visible, even though they are present. Presence does not require constant manifestation. A resident does not need to be seen at every moment to be understood as there. This aligns with the way temples functioned. The god statue was present, but the god was not always actively engaged. This intermittent engagement mirrors human patterns of work and rest. Living among structures also means sharing time. The gods are subject to calendars. Festivals recur annually. Rituals are timed to seasons. These rhythms govern divine interaction as much as human activity. The Anunnaki participate in a temporal structure that moves forward regardless of individual will. Time does not stop for them. This participation is crucial for understanding their daily life. Days are not defined by dramatic interventions. They are defined by maintenance, oversight, waiting, listening, judging. The tablets are full of these quiet activities, even if they are not always described explicitly. The absence of constant action implies routine. The physicality of structures also imposes boundaries. Walls define inside and outside, gates regulate access, sanctuaries restrict movement. The gods respect these boundaries. Certain rituals can only be performed in specific spaces. Certain individuals can only enter certain rooms. This applies to divine presence as well. The Anunnaki are associated with particular spaces, not omnipresent freedom. This spatial limitation does not diminish their authority. It contextualizes it. Power exercised within boundaries is power that must operate carefully. Decisions have localized effects. Judgments affect specific communities. The gods are not abstract forces sweeping across the land indiscriminately. They are administrators of place. The tablets reflect this administrative mindset. They describe domains, jurisdictions, and roles. One god oversees one function. Another oversees a different one. This division of labour mirrors the division of space within cities. Just as no single human governs every task, no single god governs every aspect of existence. The Anunnaki are part of this distributed system. Living among structures also creates memory. Structures remember events through layers. Each rebuild incorporates traces of what came before. Temples accumulate history physically. The gods associated with them inherit that history. The Anunnaki's presence becomes layered, not singular. They are tied not just to a place, but to its past. This layered presence explains why the tablets often speak of ancient decisions still binding the present. Decrees made long ago continue to shape outcomes. Fate is fixed because it was set within a structure that endures. The Anunnaki, as guardians of these structures, become guardians of memory. Memory, in this sense, is architectural. It is embedded in walls, rituals, and routines. The gods live within that memory. They are constrained by it as much as empowered by it. This is a very different vision from gods who float freely above time and space. As the record continues, this pattern becomes more pronounced. The Anunnaki are never shown abandoning structure entirely. Even withdrawal is structured. Even absence has rules. Living among structures means that departure is not simple. It leaves traces. It creates imbalance. This is why the texts pay such close attention to repair, purification, and restoration. When something breaks, it must be fixed. When order falters, it must be reasserted. The Anunnaki's daily existence is bound up in this process. They do not escape it by rising above the world. They remain within it. Nothing here suggests finality. The structures persist. The gods persist with them. Living among structures is not a temporary condition. It is the defining condition of divine life in the Sumerian worldview. And as long as those structures stand, the presence of the Anunnaki remains embedded within them, shaping and being shaped by the world they inhabit. When the Sumerian tablets speak about temples, they do not describe them as occasional gathering places reserved for rare moments of ritual spectacle. They describe them as lived-in spaces, as places where divine presence resides continuously, not symbolically, not intermittently, but as part of the daily fabric of the world. This difference between habitation and ceremony is essential for understanding what the Anunnaki were believed to be doing on Earth, day after day, without pause. A ceremonial space exists to be entered and exited. It comes alive only at certain times. A habitation, by contrast, exists whether anyone is watching or not. It must be maintained even in silence. It accumulates wear. It requires cleaning, provisioning, protection, and repair. The Sumerian temples described in the tablets fall firmly into this second category. They are houses, not stages. The language used in the texts makes this clear. Temples are repeatedly referred to using terms that overlap with domestic architecture. They have doors, thresholds, inner rooms, storage areas, and sleeping quarters. Offerings are brought not as abstract gestures, but as food meant to be consumed. Water is poured not simply as symbolism, but as refreshment. Clothing is prepared and changed. These are the actions one performs for someone who lives somewhere, not for a distant force that only appears on command. This understanding reshapes how we interpret daily divine life. If a temple is a habitation, then the god associated with it is expected to be present regularly, not constantly visible, but constantly accounted for. The Anunnaki, as members of the divine order, are tied to these inhabited spaces. Their presence is not imagined as hovering above the roof, but as dwelling within the structure itself. The tablets that record temple inventories are particularly revealing. They list quantities of food, drink, textiles, tools, and livestock assigned to divine households. These lists are practical. They track usage over time. They are concerned with spoilage, replenishment, and allocation. None of this makes sense if the temple is merely ceremonial. Ceremonies do not consume resources daily. Residents do. Priests and temple workers are described as performing tasks that mirror household labour. They sweep floors, they prepare meals, they manage storerooms, they repair furnishings. These tasks are framed not as acts of devotion alone, but as duties owed to the divine residents. The gods are treated as lords of households, not as abstract ideals. This household model extends to hierarchy. Just as a large estate requires administrators, scribes, cooks, guards, and labourers, so too does a temple. The divine household mirrors the human one, only larger and more complex. The Anunnaki fit into this model as senior figures within an inhabited system, not as distant symbols invoked only during festivals. Festivals themselves, when they occur, do not contradict this model. They are moments of heightened activity within an already occupied space. A household does not cease to exist between celebrations, it simply moves at a different pace. The tablets reflect this by treating festivals as intensifications, not exceptions. One of the clearest indicators that temples were considered habitations is the concern with divine comfort. Texts speak of pleasing the gods, calming them, restoring their favour. Comfort implies ongoing presence. You do not comfort someone who is not there. Anger, fatigue, dissatisfaction, and pleasure are all described in ways that assume sustained cohabitation. The Anunnaki, in this context, are not abstract forces who receive ritual energy and then withdraw. They are beings whose moods matter because their presence is continuous. If they are displeased, the household suffers. Crops fail, illness spreads, political order destabilizes. These consequences are not framed as punishment from afar, but as the effects of imbalance within a shared environment. The physical design of temples reinforces this interpretation. Inner sanctuaries are restricted spaces, not because they are theatrical, but because they are private. Access is limited in the same way access to a ruler's private chambers is limited. This privacy only makes sense if the space is occupied beyond ritual moments. The statues housed within temples are often misunderstood in modern interpretation. They are not idols meant to represent absent gods. They are anchors for presence. They allow the god to be present in a stable, localized way. The statue is washed, dressed, fed, and put to rest, because the god is believed to engage with the world through it. This engagement is not constant, but it is reliable. The Anunnaki do not need to appear physically to be present. Presence is assumed through habitation. Just as a human resident is not always seen, but their presence is known, so too with the gods. The tablets also record moments when a god leaves a temple. These moments are treated as serious crises. When a god abandons their dwelling, the city is exposed. Protection falters, order weakens. The very concept of abandonment implies prior residence. You cannot abandon what you never inhabited. This is why temple destruction is treated with such gravity. It is not merely the loss of a sacred site, it is the displacement of a divine resident. Rebuilding a temple is not simply restoring a place of worship, it is inviting the god back home. The Anunnaki's relationship to temples is thus deeply personal and spatial. Daily offerings further reinforce this view. Offerings are not only symbolic acknowledgements of power, they are sustenance. Bread, beer, meat, fruit, and oil are prepared in quantities that suggest consumption, not display. The gods are believed to partake in these offerings, even if the mechanics are not explained in literal terms. This belief has practical consequences. Offerings must be fresh. Stale food offends, neglect angers, excessive noise disturbs. These concerns mirror those of any household. The divine household is not immune to irritation. The Anunnaki, as part of this system, experience daily life as something structured around these expectations. Their authority does not free them from routine, it binds them to it. The more important the god, the more elaborate the household, the more complex the maintenance. This also explains the presence of divine calendars. Specific days are assigned for specific actions. Rest days exist alongside work days. Ritual purity is timed. These rhythms govern divine and human activity alike. The gods do not exist outside time. They live within schedules. Living within a temple also means being affected by its surroundings. Floods threaten foundations. Heat cracks walls. Insects infest storerooms. These are not abstract concerns. The tablets reflect anxiety about environmental conditions because they affect divine comfort as much as human survival. The Anunnaki's daily life, then, is not spent in constant judgment or intervention. Much of it is spent inhabiting a space that must be kept in balance. Presence alone requires effort. Stability is not automatic. It must be sustained. This model also explains why the gods are portrayed as reactive. They respond to neglect. They respond to care. Their favour is not guaranteed. It is cultivated through consistent attention. The temple is the site of that cultivation. When later traditions reinterpret temples as purely ceremonial, something essential is lost. The Sumerian texts do not support that abstraction. They insist again and again on material reality, on food, water, walls, labour, on gods who live where these things exist. The Anunnaki, within this framework, are not distant overseers who dip into the world when needed. They are residents whose daily existence unfolds within built environments that demand constant engagement. Their power is inseparable from their place. As the narrative continues, this understanding will become increasingly important, because living somewhere changes what authority feels like. It creates attachment, it creates fatigue, it creates responsibility. The temples are not stages for divine appearance, they are homes. And homes shape those who live within them, even gods. Nothing here closes. The doors remain open, the lamps stay lit. The household continues day after day, with the Anunnaki present within walls that were never meant for ceremony alone, but for habitation. Before worship crystallized into fixed ritual, before liturgies were standardized and priesthoods formalized, the Sumerian tablets point to something quieter and more fundamental. They describe rhythms that existed prior to ceremony, patterns of activity that did not yet require formal invocation or structured praise. These rhythms are not presented as inventions of religion, they are presented as conditions of existence. And within those conditions, the Anunnaki are already present, already participating. The earliest layers of Sumerian thought do not begin with prayer. They begin with order, with repetition, with the recognition that certain things happen again and again, regardless of human intention. Day follows night, heat follows coolness, water rises and recedes, hunger returns, fatigue accumulates. These cycles are not framed as sacred at first, they simply are. Worship emerges later, as a response to stability, not as its cause. The tablets preserve traces of this earlier understanding through what they assume rather than what they explain. They do not describe a moment when gods teach humans how to worship from nothing. Instead, they describe humans and gods already sharing time, already moving through days shaped by predictable sequences. The Anunnaki do not appear as initiators of rhythm, they appear as occupants of it. This is significant, because rhythm precedes meaning. A repeated action does not need explanation to exist, it only needs time. The Sumerian worldview reflects this. The earliest texts are concerned with enumeration, not devotion. Lists of offerings before hymns, calendars before myths, records of labour before praise. These documents suggest that life was structured long before it was sanctified. Within this structure, the Anunnaki are not constantly addressed. They are assumed. Their presence does not require continual acknowledgement because it is stable. A stable presence does not demand constant attention. It becomes part of the background against which activity unfolds. Daily rhythms in this early phase are practical. Work is done because it must be done. Fields are tended because crops fail otherwise. Water is managed because neglect leads to disaster. The gods, including the Anunnaki, are embedded in this practicality. Their authority is exercised through alignment with these rhythms, not through interruption of them. The tablets reflect this through their emphasis on timing rather than ritual form. Certain days matter because of what happens on them, not because of what is said. Offerings are prepared at regular intervals, not as spontaneous acts of devotion, but as maintenance. These actions resemble provisioning more than prayer. Food is given because consumption is expected. Silence follows because rest is required. This suggests that worship, as a formalized system, emerges later as a way of stabilizing interaction, not as the foundation of divine presence. The Anunnaki do not wait for worship to exist. They are already there when worship begins to take shape. The distinction matters because it reframes the daily life of the gods. If worship is not the starting point, then divine existence is not defined by being adored. It is defined by being situated within time. The Anunnaki experience days not as sequences of ceremonies, but as flows of responsibility punctuated by rest and attention. The Sumerian calendar itself reflects this origin. Early calendars track agricultural cycles before they track festivals. Months are named after activities, not gods. Planting, harvest, flood, dryness. These names encode rhythm without theology. The gods are later associated with these cycles, not the other way around. This association does not diminish divine importance. It grounds it. A god who governs a cycle does so because the cycle exists. The Anunnaki's authority emerges from their role within these rhythms, not from their ability to suspend them. The tablets also preserve language that suggests shared temporal experience. Gods wait. Gods anticipate. Gods grow impatient. These are not attributes of beings outside time. They are attributes of beings who live within sequences. Waiting implies expectation. Expectation implies duration. Fatigue appears in these texts before worship does. Gods complain of labour. They seek relief. They negotiate burdens. These concerns arise from rhythm, not ritual. Labour repeated too often becomes exhausting. Rest becomes necessary. These dynamics precede any formal system of praise. The Anunnaki, within this framework, are not defined by how often they are invoked. They are defined by how consistently they remain present across cycles. Their daily life unfolds through repetition rather than revelation. This repetition also shapes behaviour. When something is done every day, it becomes invisible. The tablets rarely describe the gods eating, resting, or moving through space because these actions are assumed. Only disruption is recorded. Only change requires explanation. This silence is telling. It suggests that divine daily life was considered unremarkable, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked novelty. The gods lived within rhythms that no longer needed narration. Worship, when it eventually formalizes, reflects these rhythms rather than creating them. Prayers are timed to dawn and dusk because those moments already matter. Festivals align with harvests because harvests already shape life. The Anunnaki do not impose sacred time. They inhabit time that has already proven meaningful. This inhabitation carries consequences. To live within rhythm is to be affected by it. When cycles fail, the gods are implicated. Drought is not merely a human problem. It reflects imbalance within the shared system. The Anunnaki are expected to respond because they are part of the rhythm, not above it. The tablets occasionally preserve moments when rhythm breaks down. Floods exceed expectation. Seasons misalign. These moments provoke divine councils, not because worship has failed, but because rhythm has been disrupted. The gods respond as managers of continuity, not as recipients of devotion. This reinforces the idea that divine authority is operational rather than performative. The Anunnaki are not sustained by praise alone. They are sustained by functioning systems. When systems fail, their authority is challenged. The emergence of worship can be seen as a human attempt to stabilize this relationship. As societies grow more complex, Informal rhythms require reinforcement. Ritual provides predictability. It anchors interaction, but it builds on an existing foundation. The Anunnaki's daily life, then, is not organised around ceremonies at first. It is organised around cycles of work, rest, attention and response. These cycles do not disappear when worship emerges. They are formalised. This formalisation brings hierarchy. Priests emerge as intermediaries. Temples become more structured. But beneath this structure, the original rhythm persists. The gods still experience time passing. They still anticipate outcomes. They still respond to conditions. The tablets hint at this persistence through their concern with timing errors. Performing an offering at the wrong time is dangerous not because the words are wrong, but because the rhythm is broken. Misalignment matters more than silence. This emphasis reveals a worldview in which presence outweighs performance. The Anunnaki do not require constant acknowledgement. They require alignment. Their daily existence unfolds through predictable patterns that must be respected. As the narrative continues, worship will take clearer shape. Hymns will multiply. Ritual language will solidify. But these developments rest on something older, a shared experience of time that binds gods and humans alike. The Anunnaki are not summoned into existence by worship. They are already there, living within rhythms that predate formal devotion. Their days are shaped not by constant praise, but by continuity. And continuity, once established, becomes the most powerful force in the world they inhabit. Nothing here resolves. The rhythm continues. Days follow days. The gods remain present within cycles that do not pause for ceremony, but quietly support it once it arrives. When the Sumerian tablets speak about food and drink in relation to the gods, they do not treat these matters as metaphors or symbolic gestures alone. They treat them as necessities. Sustenance appears not as a poetic flourish, but as a practical concern woven into the daily structure of divine existence. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as beings who transcend hunger through sheer power. They are portrayed as beings who require provision, whose presence in the world is tied to systems that must be fed, replenished, and managed with care. This does not mean the text suggests the gods eat in the same way humans do, or that divine hunger mirrors human need exactly. The tablets are rarely explicit about mechanics. What they are explicit about is expectation. Food is prepared. Drink is poured. Offerings are scheduled. Quantities are recorded. These actions are repeated with a consistency that only makes sense if sustenance is part of an ongoing logic rather than a one-time ritual act. The earliest administrative texts already reflect this logic. They list bread, beer, oil, meat, dates, milk, and grain assigned to divine households. These lists are not vague, they are precise. They specify amounts, frequencies, sources, and destinations. Precision implies accountability. Accountability implies regular consumption or use. The Anunnaki, as members of the divine order tied to temples and cities, are embedded within this economy of provision. What stands out is how little ceremony surrounds these actions in the texts themselves. The scribes do not pause to sanctify each offering in language. They record it. This recording suggests that feeding the gods was not always an event. It was a routine. Routines do not require constant explanation. They require consistency. This routine nature of sustenance challenges modern assumptions about divine self-sufficiency. In the Sumerian worldview, power does not eliminate dependency. It redistributes it. The gods depend on humans for labour and offerings. Humans depend on gods for order and fertility. This interdependence is not hidden. It is stated plainly in myths, where gods complain of labour and seek relief. Humanity is created in part to take over work and provisioning that the gods find burdensome. That creation narrative alone reveals a great deal about how sustenance is understood. The gods grow tired of maintaining canals, fields, and infrastructure. They are exhausted by the demands of keeping the world functioning. Their solution is not to withdraw from material existence, but to delegate labour. Humans are created to support the system, not to worship it abstractly. Feeding the gods becomes part of that support. The Anunnaki in this context are not distant recipients of symbolic offerings. They are participants in an economy that requires constant input. Food sustains presence. Drink stabilizes order. Neglect leads to imbalance. These ideas appear repeatedly, not through dramatic statements, but through administrative regularity. The preparation of food itself is revealing. Bread and beer, the staples of Sumerian life, appear constantly in divine contexts. These are not luxury items reserved for rare occasions. They are daily foods. Their presence in temple inventory suggests that divine sustenance mirrors human sustenance in form, if not in effect. The gods eat what the land produces. Their well-being is tied to agricultural success. This connection reinforces the idea that the Anunnaki are not above the environment. Drought affects offerings. Floods disrupt supply. Famine threatens not only humans, but the divine household as well. The gods respond to these conditions because they are implicated in them. Their sustenance depends on the same systems they oversee. Drink, particularly beer, holds a special place in this logic. Beer is not merely a beverage. It is a product of fermentation, time, and careful preparation. It represents stability. You cannot brew beer in chaos. You need predictable water, grain, and storage. Offering beer to the gods is therefore not only nourishment, it is evidence that order exists. The tablets often associate beer with calm, satisfaction, and restored balance. Gods drink and are appeased. This appeasement is not mystical alone. It reflects a worldview in which sustenance has psychological and social effects even for gods. Irritation subsides, conflict softens, decisions change. These reactions imply that divine beings experience states influenced by provision. The Anunnaki, in their role as judges and determiners of fate, are particularly sensitive to balance. A well-provisioned system produces stability. A neglected one produces resentment. The texts hint at this through episodes where gods act harshly after neglect or disorder. These actions are not framed as arbitrary. They follow breakdowns in reciprocity. Reciprocity is the core logic here. Humans provide food and drink. Gods provide order. When one side fails, the other responds. This is not morality in the modern sense. It is maintenance. The universe functions because inputs and outputs are balanced. Sustenance is an input. The regularity of offerings also creates temporal structure. Morning and evening provisions mark time. Days are punctuated by feeding. Weeks and months are tracked through cycles of supply. The Anunnaki live within this temporal framework. Their daily existence is shaped by the expectation of receiving sustenance at certain times. This expectation does not reduce divine authority. It defines it. Authority that depends on provision is authority that must remain engaged. The gods cannot simply ignore the world and remain unaffected. Their well-being is linked to its functioning. The tablets also preserve moments where gods withdraw sustenance from humans as punishment. Crops fail, rivers dry. These acts mirror human neglect of offerings. The symmetry is deliberate. Just as humans can fail to feed the gods, gods can fail to feed the world. Sustenance flows both ways. This flow further supports the idea that eating and drinking are not ceremonial abstractions. They are part of a system of exchange. Ceremonies emerge to regulate that exchange, not to replace it. The Anunnaki's daily life within this system likely involved anticipation as much as consumption. Offerings had to arrive. Stores had to be sufficient. Shortages created tension. Abundance created calm. These emotional states are implied through narrative outcomes rather than described directly. When gods gather in councils, food and drink often precede discussion. This mirrors human practice. Decisions made on empty stomachs are harsher. The texts reflect an understanding of this dynamic without articulating it explicitly. The Anunnaki, like humans, operate better within balance. The act of feeding the gods also reinforces hierarchy. Not all gods receive equal portions. Senior deities receive more elaborate offerings. Lesser gods receive simpler ones. The Anunnaki, as a collective associated with judgment and fate, occupy a specific tier. Their sustenance reflects their role. This hierarchy is carefully maintained. Maintaining it requires labour. Bakers, brewers, herders, farmers. Entire segments of society exist to support divine households. This labour is not framed as optional devotion, it is framed as obligation. The gods require feeding because the world requires gods. This perspective also explains why neglecting offerings is treated as dangerous rather than impious. Failing to feed the gods threatens the system. It is not merely disrespectful, it is destabilizing. The Anunnaki's response to neglect is therefore not personal offence alone, it is systemic correction. The physicality of sustenance also grounds divine presence. Food spoils, drink ferments too long, storage fails. These risks apply to divine households as much as human ones. The tablets reflect concern with proper storage and timing because failure affects everyone involved. The Anunnaki's daily existence, then, includes waiting for offerings, receiving them, being affected by their quality and quantity, and responding accordingly. This is not a life of constant transcendence. It is a life of embedded dependence. This embeddedness also creates intimacy. Humans interact with gods not only through prayer, but through feeding. This act creates proximity. It is difficult to imagine a more direct relationship. The gods are not distant ideals. They are beings who must be cared for. Care does not imply weakness, it implies connection. The Sumerian worldview does not equate power with isolation. It equates power with integration. The Anunnaki are powerful because they are central to the system, not because they escape it. As we move forward, this logic of sustenance will continue to shape everything else. Work exists to produce food. Temples exist to store it. Ritual exists to regulate its distribution. Judgment exists to respond to imbalance. The daily life of the Anunnaki unfolds within this web. Nothing here concludes. The need for sustenance does not end, it repeats, day after day, offering after offering. The Anunnaki remain within this cycle, not as distant recipients of symbolic gestures, but as residents whose continued presence depends on the quiet, relentless logic of feeding and being fed. When the Sumerian tablets hint at rest, they do so without drama. There are no grand declarations of divine exhaustion, no poetic laments about cosmic weariness. Instead, fatigue appears quietly, embedded in complaints, negotiations, and decisions that only make sense if the gods themselves are subject to limits. The Anunnaki are not described as endlessly active beings whose power eliminates the need for pause. They are described as participants in a system that produces strain, accumulation, and the necessity of rest. This idea unsettles modern expectations because divinity is often imagined as effortless. In the Sumerian worldview preserved on clay, effort is unavoidable. Even gods labour. Even gods grow tired. Even gods seek relief. The tablets do not frame this as weakness. They frame it as reality. One of the clearest indications of divine fatigue appears in the creation narratives themselves. Before humans exist, the gods perform the work required to maintain the world. They dig canals, they manage water, they shape land, they carry out tasks that are repetitive, physical, and unending. The texts describe complaints, murmuring, unrest. These are not symbolic metaphors. They are expressions of strain within a system that demands constant input. The Anunnaki exist within the consequences of that system. Even when labour is delegated to humanity, responsibility does not disappear. Oversight remains, judgment remains, presence remains. Delegation reduces physical burden, but it does not eliminate the cognitive and temporal load of maintaining order. The tablets reflect this through ongoing divine counsels, disputes, and corrective actions. Rest therefore becomes necessary, not as indulgence, but as maintenance. The gods withdraw at times. They retreat into specific spaces. They are described as sleeping, waiting, or remaining inactive. These moments are not treated as failures of duty. They are treated as expected phases within a cycle of exertion and recovery. The language used to describe divine rest is revealing. It mirrors human rest. Gods lie down. Gods sleep. Gods are disturbed by noise. These descriptions are not accidental anthropomorphisms. They reflect a worldview in which divine bodies, whatever their nature, are affected by conditions. Noise irritates, overcrowding disturbs, excess activity disrupts equilibrium. The flood narratives make this especially clear. One of the motivations for catastrophe is not moral corruption, but noise. Humanity becomes too loud, too active, too present. This noise prevents the gods from resting. The fact that lack of rest can justify such a drastic response reveals how seriously fatigue is taken in the divine economy. This is not an emotional outburst. It is a systems failure. Too much activity overwhelms capacity. Rest becomes impossible. The system responds by reducing load. In this sense, the flood is framed not as punishment alone, but as a corrective measure aimed at restoring balance. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and decree, participate in these decisions. Their role implies sustained attention over long periods. Attention itself is exhausting. To judge fate, to weigh outcomes, to enforce boundaries between realms requires focus. Focus cannot be infinite. It must be renewed. This need for renewal appears again in ritual calendars. There are days of activity and days of restraint. Certain times are designated for action, others for cessation. These rhythms apply to gods as much as humans. The Anunnaki live within a temporal structure that acknowledges limits. The idea of divine bodies having limits does not mean they are fragile. It means they are situated. They exist within time, space, and causality. They are affected by environmental conditions, heat, noise, disruption, neglect. These factors influence divine disposition. The tablets do not describe the Anunnaki as purely incorporeal. They interact with food. They inhabit spaces. They experience satisfaction and irritation. These interactions imply some form of embodiment, even if that embodiment differs from human flesh. A being that eats, rests, and is disturbed by noise is not entirely abstract. This embodiment explains why rest is necessary. Bodies accumulate strain. Presence requires energy. Decision-making depletes attention. Without rest, imbalance follows. The texts also suggest that rest is not evenly distributed among the gods. Senior deities seek rest more aggressively. Lesser gods perform more labour. This hierarchy reflects human social structures, but it also reflects an understanding of capacity. Those with greater authority carry greater responsibility, and responsibility produces fatigue. The Anunnaki occupy a specific tier within this hierarchy. They are not the most physically burdened gods, but they are deeply involved in judgment. Judgment is not passive. It requires engagement with outcomes that affect the entire system. This engagement cannot be continuous without consequence. Rest, therefore, becomes part of divine governance. To rest is not to abandon duty. It is to preserve the ability to perform it. The gods do not disappear when they rest. They withdraw temporarily. Their presence becomes less active, but it does not vanish. This withdrawal has implications for the world. When gods rest, oversight weakens. Chaos can increase. Humans notice changes. Crops may fail. Disputes escalate. These fluctuations are interpreted as signs of divine displeasure or absence, but they can also be understood as the natural result of reduced intervention. The tablets do not frame these fluctuations as errors. They are part of a living system. No system operates at maximum output constantly. Variation is expected. The concept of divine fatigue also reshapes how we understand divine anger. Anger often follows prolonged strain. Noise accumulates. Neglect persists. Balance erodes. The response appears sudden, but it is the result of long-term pressure. The Anunnaki's role in enforcing limits reflects an awareness of these pressures. Population controls are instituted. Lifespans are shortened. Fertility is regulated. These measures are not moral judgments. They are load management strategies. They reduce strain on the system. Rest, in this context, is not luxury. It is survival. Even gods must preserve their capacity to function. This idea challenges the notion of omnipotence. The Sumerian gods are powerful, but not limitless. Their power operates within constraints. These constraints are not imposed by a higher force. They emerge from the structure of reality itself. Reality requires balance. Balance requires rest. The Anunnaki, as custodians of balance, must observe this principle themselves. The tablets also hint that rest is communal. Gods rest together. Councils pause. Activity slows. This shared rest reinforces hierarchy and cohesion. It allows recalibration. Decisions made after rest differ from decisions made under strain. This dynamic mirrors human governance. Leaders who never rest become erratic. Systems that never pause collapse. The Sumerian worldview applies this logic universally. The presence of rest in divine life also explains why worship includes silence. Quiet offerings, stillness. These acts are not only expressions of reverence, they are accommodations. Humans are expected to reduce disturbance, to allow divine rest. Noise is dangerous not because it is sinful, but because it disrupts recovery. The Anunnaki's intolerance for noise reflects a physiological limit, not a moral one. This perspective humanizes the gods without diminishing them. It makes their actions comprehensible. It grounds divine behavior in recognizable dynamics of effort and recovery. As the narrative continues, the consequences of fatigue will become more visible. Delegation increases. Presence becomes less direct. Systems are put in place to reduce constant engagement. Management replaces participation. These changes are not failures, they are adaptations. Adaptations to the reality that even divine bodies have limits. Nothing here resolves into final rest. Rest is temporary. Activity resumes. The cycle continues. The Anunnaki move between exertion and withdrawal, presence and distance, engagement and rest. Their daily life unfolds within this oscillation, not as endless action, not as perpetual stillness, but as movement shaped by the recognition that without rest, even gods cannot sustain the world they inhabit. When the Sumerian tablets speak of divine work, they do not describe it as something accomplished through distant command alone. They do not portray a world that responds automatically to spoken decrees issued from an unreachable height. Instead, they describe labour that requires presence, oversight that requires attendance, authority that must be exercised from within the system rather than imposed from outside it. The Anunnaki are not shown ruling the world by issuing occasional instructions and then withdrawing. They are shown participating in processes that demand ongoing involvement. This distinction between command and attendance is critical. A command can be issued once and forgotten. Attendance requires time, focus, and sustained engagement. The tablets consistently imply the latter. Gods assemble, gods deliberate, gods listen, gods respond. These actions are not instantaneous. They unfold within shared space and shared time. The earliest myths make this explicit. Before humans exist, the gods themselves perform the work necessary to maintain order. They do not simply declare canals dug or fields irrigated. They dig, they manage, they endure. This work produces fatigue precisely because it requires presence. It cannot be completed through abstraction. When humanity is created, it is not to replace divine authority, but to relieve divine labour. This detail is often misunderstood. Humans are not created to obey commands at a distance. They are created to take over tasks that require constant attention. Digging canals, maintaining infrastructure, producing food. These are not one-time acts. They require daily attendance. The Anunnaki's role shifts as a result, but it does not disappear. Oversight replaces execution. Judgment replaces manual labour. Yet even oversight demands presence. One cannot oversee without observing. One cannot judge without hearing. The Anunnaki remain embedded in the processes they govern. The tablets preserve scenes of divine assemblies where issues are debated. These assemblies are not symbolic. They are procedural. Problems arise. Noise increases. Population grows. Resources strain. The gods gather to discuss solutions. Discussion implies uncertainty. It implies evaluation. It implies time spent considering outcomes. This is not command issuing from omniscience. It is governance operating under constraint. The Anunnaki do not already know the best solution in every case. They weigh options. They disagree. They compromise. These dynamics only make sense if work is understood as something that unfolds through engagement, rather than through absolute control. Attendance is also implied by the way divine decisions have consequences. When a decree is issued, it does not instantly resolve the situation. Effects take time. Humans respond. Systems adjust. New problems emerge. The gods observe these outcomes and respond again. This feedback loop requires sustained presence. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment, are particularly bound to this loop. Fate is not fixed once and forgotten. It is monitored, adjusted, reinforced. Boundaries between realms must be maintained continuously. The underworld does not govern itself automatically. It requires judges who are present. This presence is not constant visibility. It is constant availability. The gods can be approached, appealed to, petitioned. This is why prayer and offerings matter. They are not magical commands, they are communications. Communication presupposes that someone is listening. Listening requires attention. Attention requires time. Time requires attendance. The tablets also reflect this through the concern with proper procedure. Rituals must be performed correctly. Appeals must be made through the right channels. Errors have consequences. These procedural details mirror administrative systems where officials must be present to enforce rules. If divine work were purely command-based, procedure would be irrelevant. A command overrides error. In the Sumerian worldview, error matters because systems are mediated, not absolute. The Anunnaki's authority operates within these mediations. They do not bypass structure, they enforce it. Enforcement requires being there when breaches occur. This is particularly evident in legal texts. Oaths are sworn in the presence of gods. The presence is not metaphorical, it is assumed. The god witnesses the oath. Witnessing is an act. It requires presence at a specific moment. The idea of gods as witnesses reinforces the notion that divine work involves attendance. A witness must observe. Observation requires being situated within time and space. The tablets rarely depict gods issuing commands that act instantly across the world. Instead, they depict gods responding to reports, complaints, and conditions. This reactive posture does not imply weakness. It implies governance. Governance differs fundamentally from command. Command assumes absolute authority. Governance assumes responsibility. Responsibility binds the authority figure to outcomes. The Anunnaki are responsible for the functioning of the world they oversee. This responsibility is burdensome. It requires constant engagement. It produces fatigue. It necessitates rest. All of these themes recur because attendance is costly. The myth of divine labour rebellion illustrates this cost clearly. Lesser gods complain about their workload. They refuse to continue. This rebellion is not against command. It is against labour, against attendance, against the demand to be constantly present. The solution is not to issue harsher commands, it is to restructure the system. Humans are created to absorb attendance-heavy tasks. The gods retain authority, but reduce physical presence. Yet even after this restructuring, attendance does not disappear. It shifts. The Anunnaki attend councils instead of canals. They attend judgments instead of fields. The nature of work changes, but the requirement to be present remains. This shift also introduces distance, but not absence. The gods are less visible in daily manual tasks, but they remain involved in decision-making. This involvement is reflected in the increasing complexity of ritual and law. Ritual becomes a way to structure access. Law becomes a way to formalize judgment. These systems reduce the need for constant divine attendance by creating predictable processes. But they do not eliminate divine oversight. The Anunnaki's daily existence, then, is not one of issuing commands from isolation. It is one of managing systems that have been designed to function in their presence, but not independently of it. This management includes monitoring compliance. When humans neglect offerings, the gods respond. When cities grow too loud, the gods react. These reactions are not immediate commands, they are escalations. Escalation implies tolerance. Tolerance implies patience. Patience implies ongoing presence even when conditions are imperfect. The flood narrative demonstrates this escalation clearly. The gods do not immediately destroy humanity when noise increases. They attempt other measures. Only when rest becomes impossible does catastrophe follow. This sequence reflects governance, not command. The Anunnaki's participation in such decisions underscores their attendance. They are present for the discussion. They are present for the consequences. They are present for the aftermath. After the flood, new limits are instituted. Lifespans are shortened. Fertility is controlled. These are systemic adjustments designed to reduce ongoing strain. They reflect a desire to minimize future attendance costs. In other words, the gods redesign the system to require less constant intervention. This redesign acknowledges their own limits. Attendance also explains why divine anger is often delayed. Anger accumulates over time. It is not instantaneous. The tablets reflect this accumulation. Grievances build, complaints multiply, responses intensify. This temporal build-up contradicts interpretations that imagine gods as impulsive tyrants. The Sumerian gods are reactive, but they are also patient. Patience is meaningless without presence. The Anunnaki's role in judgment also requires continuity. To judge fairly, one must understand context. Context requires memory. Memory requires time spent observing. The tablets preserve this memory through genealogies, lists, and records. These records function as extensions of divine attention. They allow gods and humans alike to track obligations and outcomes. The administrative nature of these records reinforces the idea that divine work is bureaucratic rather than theatrical. Bureaucracy exists to manage complexity. It assumes ongoing presence. The Anunnaki operate within this bureaucratic cosmos. They are not above it, they are at its centre. This centre is not a throne removed from reality. It is a node within a network of relationships. Relationships require maintenance. Maintenance requires attendance. The gods' increasing reliance on intermediaries reflects an attempt to manage attendance demands. Priests act on behalf of gods. Kings rule under divine authority. These intermediaries reduce the need for direct divine involvement, but they do not eliminate it. The Anunnaki remain the final arbiters. Their judgment cannot be fully delegated. This irreducible role ensures that attendance remains necessary. As the world grows more complex, the cost of attendance grows. Systems proliferate. Populations increase. Noise returns. Fatigue accumulates again. This dynamic sets the stage for later developments where divine presence becomes more abstract, more symbolic. But at this stage, in the earliest tablets, work still requires attendance. the gods have not yet fully withdrawn behind layers of ritual and hierarchy. They are still close enough that their work is felt directly. This closeness shapes the tone of the texts. There is little awestruck distance. There is familiarity. There is negotiation. There is frustration. The Anunnaki are powerful, but they are not unreachable. They are not beyond the world. They are within it, working to keep it from unravelling. Nothing here reaches resolution. Attendance does not end. Work continues. Systems evolve to reduce strain, but presence remains necessary. The daily life of the Anunnaki unfolds not through commanding from afar, but through staying close enough to act, respond, and adjust. Their authority is exercised through participation, not isolation. And as long as the world requires management rather than mere instruction, that participation remains unavoidable. When the Sumerian tablets describe the movement of gods, they do not direct our attention upward. They do not linger on the sky as a highway or the heavens as a place of constant traffic. Instead, movement unfolds horizontally, through streets, between cities, along rivers, across boundaries that humans themselves recognize and navigate. The Anunnaki do not traverse the world as distant figures passing overhead. They move within it. This distinction is easy to miss because later traditions emphasize ascent and descent, heavenly journeys and vertical hierarchies. The earlier Sumerian material is far less interested in that imagery. It is concerned with proximity, with location, with the fact that divine presence shifts from place to place in ways that resemble travel rather than apparition. When gods are said to go somewhere, they go to cities, they enter temples, they cross borders between regions, they descend into the underworld through gates. These movements are described using the same conceptual language applied to human travel. Roads matter, thresholds matter, entry and exit matter. The Anunnaki are not imagined as bypassing these structures. They are subject to them. The city, in Sumerian thought, is not just a human settlement. It is an ordered space carved out of chaos. It has walls, gates, canals, districts, and sanctuaries. To move through a city is to engage with order. The gods, by moving through cities, demonstrate that they operate within that order rather than above it. This becomes especially clear in texts where gods are said to leave one city and enter another. These transitions are not instantaneous. They are events. They require preparation. Rituals accompany departure and arrival. Temples respond, priests act, the world adjusts. None of this would be necessary if gods moved invisibly through the sky. The Anunnaki, as figures embedded in governance and judgment, move where governance and judgment are required. Disputes arise in specific places. Cities petition for favour. Regions fall into disorder. The gods go where the problems are. This movement is purposeful, not theatrical. The tablets preserve references to divine processions that move through urban spaces. These are not symbolic parades for human benefit alone. They are understood as real movements of divine presence. The route matters. The stops matter. The timing matters. Movement is constrained by geography and sequence. This spatial constraint implies embodiment of some kind. A being that moves through cities must navigate space. It must occupy one location before another. It must pass through intermediate points. The Anunnaki, whatever their nature, are imagined as subject to these spatial realities. The underworld provides a particularly clear example. Entry into the underworld is not achieved by falling or teleportation. It is achieved by passing through gates. Each gate has a function. Each gate enforces a rule. Even powerful gods are stripped of attributes as they pass through. Movement here is procedural. It cannot be skipped. This procedural movement stands in contrast to later ideas of instant travel or omnipresence. In the Sumerian worldview, even divine mobility respects structure. Boundaries exist. Crossing them requires compliance. The sky, by contrast, is rarely described as a space of routine movement. It is a domain, not a roadway. It houses celestial bodies that move according to fixed patterns, not wandering gods. When gods are associated with the sky, they are associated with position and oversight, not travel. This absence of skyward movement is telling. It suggests that the Anunnaki's daily life did not involve coming and going from above. Their presence was terrestrial. Their concerns were terrestrial. Their movement followed the logic of the world they inhabited. Rivers, for example, appear frequently as routes. Gods are associated with specific waterways. Movement along rivers mirrors human trade and communication. Rivers connect cities. They distribute resources. They carry messages. Gods who move along these routes participate in the same connective infrastructure. This participation reinforces the idea that divine authority is exercised through networks rather than through domination from afar. The Anunnaki do not impose order by hovering. They reinforce it by being present where it must be maintained. The language of journey in the tablets further supports this view. Verbs imply going, entering, leaving, standing, arriving. These verbs assume distance and duration. They imply that time passes during movement. A god who travels takes time to do so. Time spent travelling is time not spent elsewhere. This limitation matters. It implies prioritization. A god cannot attend to everything simultaneously. Decisions must be made about where to go and when. This prioritization explains why divine absence is felt. When a god leaves a city, protection weakens. When a god arrives, conditions change. These changes are not framed as illusions. They are consequences of present shifting location. The Anunnaki's role as judges also depends on this mobility. Judgment occurs where cases arise. Fate is decreed in response to specific situations. The gods go where judgment is needed. Assemblies of gods further illustrate this pattern. Assemblies require gathering. Gathering requires movement. Gods come together at a place. That place is named. It is not abstract. It is a location within the cosmic geography. Even the heavens, when described architecturally, have fixed locations. Councils meet somewhere. Thrones are placed somewhere. The idea of gods drifting freely through space is absent. Structure governs movement. This structured movement also implies familiarity with place. The Anunnaki know cities. They know regions. They recognize boundaries. This knowledge comes from repeated presence. One does not become familiar with a place by passing over it. One becomes familiar by moving through it. The tablets occasionally describe gods becoming attached to cities. Patronage is not static. A god can abandon a city and favour another. This shift requires relocation. The god's presence moves. The city responds. Rituals mark the change. Such shifts are emotionally charged in the texts. Lamentations mourn divine departure. These laments treat the absence as real. The god is no longer there. The city is exposed. This emotional weight would be meaningless if gods were never truly present. Movement through cities also implies interaction. Streets are not empty. Cities are noisy, crowded, active. Gods moving through them are exposed to human life. Noise becomes an issue. Disorder becomes visible. This exposure contributes to fatigue. The flood narrative again provides context. Human noise rises. Cities grow dense. The gods are disturbed. This disturbance would not occur if gods observe from a distance. It occurs because they are close enough to be affected. The Anunnaki's intolerance for noise is not an abstract moral failing. It is a reaction to proximity. Movement through cities brings gods into contact with human excess. This contact has consequences. Movement also reinforces accountability. A god who enters a city becomes associated with its fate. Success and failure are linked to presence. If a city prospers, the god is praised. If it fails, the god is blamed. This accountability binds gods to places. The tablets reflect this binding through curses and blessings tied to divine movement. A god's arrival brings fertility. Departure brings desolation. These outcomes depend on location, not on universal decree. This localization of divine influence challenges ideas of omnipresent control. The Sumerian gods are powerful, but their power is distributed. It operates where they are. The Anunnaki, as part of this system, do not float above it. They navigate it. Their daily life includes travel that is constrained, purposeful, and costly. Travel requires preparation. Rituals precede movement. Offerings are made. Permissions are sought. These preparations suggest that movement is not trivial. It carries risk and consequence. The gods' movement also affects human schedules. Festivals are timed to divine presence. Absence delays action. Arrival initiates change. This synchronization reinforces shared time. Shared time implies shared experience. The Anunnaki do not exist in a separate temporal plane. Their days unfold alongside human days, even if their perspective differs. This alignment deepens the sense of cohabitation. Gods and humans inhabit the same world, moving through the same spaces, responding to the same disruptions. The lack of sky-focused movement imagery in the earliest tablets is therefore not an oversight. It reflects a worldview grounded in place. The sky is distant, the city is immediate. Divine life unfolds where life happens. As later traditions develop, vertical imagery increases. Ascents, descents, heavenly journeys become more prominent. These developments correspond with increasing abstraction of divine presence. Distance grows, mediation increases. But in the period reflected by the earliest tablets, the Anunnaki are still close. Their movement is still terrestrial. Their concerns are still tied to streets, walls, gates, and courts. This closeness shapes everything else. Fatigue increases. Management becomes necessary. Delegation expands. Systems evolve to reduce the need for constant movement. Yet movement never disappears entirely. Someone must go. Someone must attend. Someone must be present where judgment is required. The Anunnaki fulfill that role. They move through cities not because they lack power to move elsewhere, but because power in this worldview is exercised through presence, not distance. Nothing here resolves into stillness. Movement continues. Cities change. Boundaries shift. The gods follow the logic of the world they inhabit. The daily life of the Anunnaki is not written in the sky. It is written in streets, temples, gates, and corridors. It unfolds through travel that binds them to place, to consequence, and to the persistent demands of a world that does not stop simply because gods exist within it. When the Sumerian tablets describe encounters between gods and humans, they do not frame them as rare intrusions into ordinary life. They do not treat interaction as something extraordinary that shatters the normal order. Instead, interaction appears as expected, regulated, and repeatable. The Anunnaki do not descend dramatically to announce truths. They engage with people as part of an ongoing system that already assumes contact. This difference is crucial. Revelation implies interruption. It suggests that the divine breaks into human affairs only at special moments. The Sumerian texts do not support that model. They present a world in which gods and humans occupy overlapping spaces, governed by protocols that make interaction predictable rather than astonishing. The tablets reflect this predictability through their tone. When humans approach gods, they do so through established channels. They bring offerings. They present petitions. They wait for response. There is no emphasis on shock or fear at the mere act of contact. Fear appears when judgment is imminent, not when presence is acknowledged. This suggests that divine interaction was not imagined as overwhelming by default. It was structured. A king stands before a god in a dream or a temple. A priest speaks on behalf of a city. A worker fulfills an obligation assigned by divine decree. These actions are carried out calmly, according to expectation. Dreams in particular illustrate this routine quality. Dreams are not portrayed as unpredictable mystical events. They are communication methods. Gods speak through them because they are efficient and controlled. A dream does not require physical manifestation. It does not disrupt public order. It delivers information privately. The Anunnaki use dreams not to reveal cosmic secrets, but to issue instructions, warnings, or confirmations. These messages are practical. Build this, prepare for that, change behavior. The tone is administrative rather than ecstatic. The dreamer wakes and acts. This practicality extends to omens and signs. Omens are not miracles. They are indicators embedded in the natural world. A liver inspection, a pattern in the sky, an unusual birth. These signs are read by specialists trained to interpret them. Interpretation implies regularity. You cannot interpret what never repeats. The presence of professional diviners further reinforces the routine nature of interaction. Diviners exist because interaction is frequent enough to require mediation. They translate divine signals into human decisions. This profession would not exist if contact were rare. The Anunnaki's authority is thus filtered through institutions rather than delivered through constant personal encounters. This filtering does not reduce interaction. It normalizes it. It makes divine input manageable. The tablets also describe gods responding to complaints. Cities complain about neglect. Kings complain about rivals. Individuals complain about misfortune. The gods hear these complaints and respond according to established patterns. Sometimes favour is granted, sometimes it is denied, sometimes punishment follows. What is striking is how little emphasis is placed on the act of hearing itself. The gods are expected to hear. Their hearing is not miraculous. It is part of their role. Silence from the gods is meaningful precisely because response is expected. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment, exemplify this expectation. They are invoked in legal contexts. Oaths are sworn before them. Disputes are settled under their authority. These acts presume that the gods are present and attentive, not absent and distant. Legal invocation of gods is not dramatic. It is procedural. A name is spoken. A formula is recited. The case proceeds. The divine role is assumed, not highlighted. This procedural calm reflects familiarity. Familiarity also appears in the way gods reprimand humans. Reprimands are specific. They address concrete failures, neglected offerings, broken agreements, excessive noise. These are not cosmic sins. They are breaches of routine. The Anunnaki's displeasure is therefore framed as corrective rather than revelatory. They do not appear to announce new moral systems. They enforce existing ones. This enforcement requires repeated interaction. Humans must know what is expected. Expectations must be communicated. Communication must occur regularly. The tablets reflect this through repeated formulas, repeated rituals, repeated warnings. The repetition itself is revealing. If interaction were rare, repetition would be unnecessary. The fact that the same structures appear again and again suggests that divine human contact was imagined as ongoing. The king's role further illustrates this. Kings act as intermediaries, not because gods cannot speak directly, but because direct interaction is structured. The king embodies the relationship. He receives favour. He receives rebuke. His success or failure reflects the state of the relationship. Kings do not marvel at speaking with gods. They worry about consequences. They worry about maintaining favour. This worry indicates that interaction is a responsibility, not a privilege. The tablets also preserve moments where gods intervene directly in human affairs without ceremony. A god advises, a god warns, a god obstructs. These interventions are woven into narratives without emphasis. They are part of the flow. Even divine anger, when expressed, is rarely theatrical. It is effective. Crops fail. Enemies succeed. Illness spreads. The cause is understood. The response is sought. Interaction resumes. This pattern shows that interaction is cyclical. Action leads to consequence. Consequence leads to response. Response leads to adjustment. The Anunnaki are embedded in this cycle. The absence of constant awe in these interactions is not irreverence. It is normalcy. The gods are powerful, but they are part of life. Fear arises when boundaries are crossed, not when presence is acknowledged. This also explains why the texts emphasize correct procedure so strongly. When interaction is routine, mistakes matter. An incorrect offering, a mistimed ritual, a broken oath. These errors disrupt the system. Disruption invites response. Response restores balance. Balance resumes routine. The Anunnaki's role in this process is not to dazzle. It is to regulate. Regulation requires predictability. Predictability requires routine interaction. The tablets also hint at impatience on the divine side. Gods tire of repeated complaints. They grow weary of constant appeals. This weariness would not exist if interaction were rare. Weariness implies frequency. Frequency implies expectation. The flood narrative again illustrates this dynamic. Humanity's noise is not a single event. It accumulates. The gods tolerate it for a time. They attempt measures. Only when routine disruption becomes unbearable does drastic action occur. This escalation pattern mirrors human governance. Authorities tolerate minor infractions. They issue warnings. They adjust policy. Extreme measures come last. The Anunnaki act as authorities within a shared system. Their interaction with humans follows administrative logic, not revelatory spectacle. This logic also explains the gradual distancing that occurs later. As populations grow and complexity increases, routine interaction becomes burdensome. Systems are formalized. Intermediaries multiply. Direct contact becomes rarer, not because gods withdraw entirely, but because routine requires insulation. At this stage, however, the insulation is incomplete. Interaction remains direct enough to feel ordinary. The gods are still close. This closeness shapes human behavior. People do not wait for miracles. They maintain relationships. They fulfill obligations. They respond to signs. They adjust behavior. The Anunnaki, in turn, do not wait for worshipful awe. They expect compliance. They expect maintenance. They expect quiet when rest is needed. This mutual expectation forms the backbone of daily life. Interaction is not a disruption of routine. It is the mechanism by which routine continues. The tablets do not glorify this mechanism. They document it. Documentation implies normalcy. One does not document the extraordinary in administrative lists. One documents what must be tracked. Tracking implies ongoing interaction. The Anunnaki are tracked because they matter daily. This daily relevance also explains why gods are invoked in mundane matters. Contracts, boundaries, weights, measures. These are not spiritual crises. They are practical concerns. The gods are involved because order depends on them. Order, in the Sumerian worldview, is not self-sustaining. It requires attention. Interaction is that attention. The Anunnaki's presence within the system is therefore constant but understated. They do not announce themselves. They are assumed. Their influence is felt through continuity rather than surprise. As the narrative moves forward, this routine interaction will begin to strain. Fatigue will increase. Distance will grow. Management will replace presence more fully. But here, at this stage, interaction remains part of everyday reality. Not revelation, not intrusion, not spectacle, just routine. The gods speak, humans respond, systems adjust, days continue. Nothing ends here. Interaction persists, quiet and procedural, shaping a world where divine presence is not something to marvel at, but something to live with. When the Sumerian tablets describe authority, they do not frame it as something imposed through constant coercion or overwhelming displays of power. They do not present the Anunnaki as rulers who must continually assert dominance through destruction, spectacle, or fear. Instead, authority emerges through presence, through being there, through occupying space long enough that order forms around it. This distinction is subtle but central. Force is episodic. It appears in moments of crisis. Presence is continuous. It shapes behaviour before crisis ever arises. The Anunnaki's authority operates primarily through this second mode. Their power is real, but it does not need to announce itself constantly because it is already embedded in the structure of daily life. The tablets reflect this embedding in the way divine authority is assumed rather than emphasized. Laws are sworn before gods without elaborate justification. Decrees are attributed to divine will without dramatic preface. The gods do not need to demonstrate power to validate it. Their authority is taken for granted because they remain present within the systems that function. Presence creates expectation. Expectation shapes behaviour. When humans know that divine oversight is continuous, they adjust accordingly. They do not wait for punishment to behave cautiously. They maintain offerings. They respect boundaries. They observe rituals. These behaviours arise not from fear of sudden force, but from awareness of sustained attention. The Anunnaki's role as judges illustrates this clearly. Judgment does not require violence to be effective. It requires legitimacy. Legitimacy comes from continuity. A judge who appears once and disappears cannot establish authority. A judge who remains becomes part of the legal landscape. The underworld narratives demonstrate this principle. The Anunnaki sit in judgment not as executioners, but as arbiters. They pronounce outcomes. They enforce rules that already exist. Their authority is not questioned because it is consistent. Souls submit not because of immediate threat, but because the structure is known. This model of authority also explains why the gods tolerate disorder for extended periods. Noise accumulates. Cities grow crowded. Humans overstep boundaries. The gods do not immediately respond with force. They observe. They deliberate. They attempt adjustments. Force is a last resort, not a default. This restraint is not weakness. It is governance. Force destabilizes systems. Presence stabilizes them. The Anunnaki, responsible for maintaining order, avoid unnecessary disruption. Their authority works best when it is invisible. Invisible authority is often the most effective. It shapes outcomes without drawing attention to itself. The tablets reflect this through their lack of emphasis on divine intervention. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens. The world functions. Crops grow. Laws are followed. This functioning is itself evidence of authority. When force does appear, it is framed as corrective, not expressive. The flood, for example, is not a display of power for its own sake. It is a response to accumulated imbalance. It resets conditions that have become unsustainable. Even then, it is followed by negotiation and restructuring rather than continued domination. The Anunnaki participate in these decisions not as enforcers eager to act, but as administrators weighing consequences. Their authority is bound to responsibility. Responsibility encourages caution. This caution also appears in the way gods communicate displeasure. Warnings precede punishment. Omens appear before disaster. These signals are opportunities for correction. Authority expressed through presence allows for feedback. Force eliminates feedback by ending interaction. The tablets show that gods prefer correction to destruction. Destruction is costly. It disrupts offerings. It reduces labour. It increases chaos. The Anunnaki, embedded in the system, feel these costs directly. Presence also creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces the need for intimidation. Humans know what is expected. The gods do not need to threaten constantly. Their expectations are reinforced through routine interaction. This routine interaction includes oversight of mundane matters, weights and measures, contracts, borders. These details are not glamorous, but they are foundational. Authority that governs small things does not need to demonstrate power through large ones. The Anunnaki's association with fate further reinforces this idea. Fate is not forceful. It unfolds. It manifests through sequences of events rather than sudden acts. The gods set conditions, outcomes follow. This indirect influence requires patience and presence. Patience is incompatible with constant force. force demands immediate resolution. The Sumerian worldview values endurance. Authority that lasts must be sustainable. The presence-based authority also explains why gods are offended by neglect rather than by defiance alone. Neglect undermines presence. It erodes the relationship. Force can punish defiance, but it cannot restore presence. Restoration requires engagement. Engagement takes time. Time requires proximity. Proximity requires presence. The tablets also reflect this in the way divine favour is restored. Sacrifice, silence, repair. These actions are not dramatic. They are sustained efforts. Authority responds to these efforts because it is relational, not absolute. The Anunnaki do not rule through constant fear. Fear appears when boundaries are crossed egregiously. Most of the time, compliance arises from habit. Habit arises from repeated experience of presence. This presence is not always comforting. It can be oppressive. It can be demanding. But it is predictable. Predictability allows societies to function. The kingship ideology reinforces this model. Kings rule not through constant violence, but through visibility. Processions, court sessions, public judgment. The king's presence stabilizes the realm. Divine authority operates similarly. The Anunnaki's presence legitimizes human authority. Kings rule by divine sanction because gods are present to witness and judge. This witnessing does not require force. It requires attention. Attention is a form of power. To be seen is to be accountable. The god's presence makes humans accountable. This accountability shapes behavior even in the absence of immediate consequence. The fear is not of punishment, but of being out of alignment. Alignment matters because presence persists. The gradual shift toward distance in later traditions reflects the strain of maintaining this presence as populations grow. Distance requires replacement mechanisms. Laws become codified. Rituals become formalized. Authority becomes more abstract. But at this stage, authority is still personal. It is exercised through proximity. The gods are close enough to be affected by human behavior. This closeness limits the use of force. Force harms the relationship. The Anunnaki's authority is therefore quieter than modern expectations. It is not less powerful. It is differently expressed. Power that relies on force must continually reassert itself. Power that relies on presence accumulates quietly. The tablets preserve this accumulation. They do not celebrate it, they assume it. Authority does not need explanation when it is already established. This established authority allows the gods to withdraw occasionally without collapse. Presence does not mean constant activity. It means continued relevance. Even when the gods rest, their authority remains. This enduring authority shapes the world long after individual actions fade. Decrees remain binding. Boundaries remain enforced. Fate continues to unfold. The Anunnaki's daily life within this system involves attention rather than aggression, oversight rather than intimidation, presence rather than force. Nothing here resolves into final dominance. Authority must be maintained, presence must be renewed, systems must be adjusted. As the narrative continues, we will see how maintaining authority through presence becomes increasingly demanding. Fatigue grows, distance increases, management replaces proximity. But for now, the tablets show a world where authority does not need to shout, it simply needs to stay, and the Anunnaki stay. When the Sumerian tablets speak of discomfort and illness among the gods, they do not do so as allegory alone. They treat these conditions as disruptions within a system that depends on balance. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as immune to disturbance. They're portrayed as beings whose well-being is tied directly to order, and whose suffering signals that order has been compromised. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the Sumerian worldview. Illness is not framed primarily as punishment or moral failure. It is framed as imbalance. Something is out of alignment. Noise has exceeded tolerance. Labour has accumulated without relief. Boundaries have been crossed too often. The response to discomfort is not condemnation, but correction. The texts rarely describe divine illness in explicit physiological terms, yet the implications are clear. Gods become irritated. Gods withdraw. Gods act harshly after prolonged strain. These behaviours are not random. They follow periods of disorder. Discomfort accumulates before response occurs. This accumulation matters. It suggests that the gods endure conditions for a time before reacting. Endurance implies tolerance. Tolerance implies limits. Once those limits are reached, intervention follows. The Anunnaki participate in this process as regulators of balance, not as initiators of suffering. The association between noise and divine discomfort is particularly striking. Human noise is not described as sinful speech or blasphemy. It is described as volume, density, activity. The cities become too full, the nights too loud. Rest becomes impossible. This disturbance produces divine irritation not because humans are morally corrupt, but because the environment has become unlivable. This framing shifts how we understand divine illness. It is environmental rather than ethical. The gods are affected by conditions. When conditions deteriorate, divine well-being declines. This decline manifests as anger, withdrawal, or drastic decision-making. The Anunnaki, as part of the Divine Council, are involved in assessing these conditions. They do not act impulsively. They observe patterns. They recognize strain. Their judgments reflect attempts to restore equilibrium. Restoration often involves imposing limits. Limits on population, limits on lifespan, limits on fertility. These measures are not portrayed as cruelty. They are portrayed as necessity. The system cannot sustain unchecked growth. Discomfort signals overload. The tablets also connect illness with ritual impurity. Impurity is not moral stain. It is contamination. Something that should be separate has mixed. Order requires separation. Heaven and earth are separated. Life and death are separated. Sacred and profane are separated. When separation fails, illness follows. This logic applies to gods as well as humans. Divine spaces must be kept pure. Noise violates purity. Neglect violates purity. Disorder violates purity. Illness arises when these violations persist. The Anunnaki's concern with purity underscores their role as guardians of boundaries. Boundaries are not abstract rules. They are practical necessities. Without boundaries, systems collapse into chaos. Illness in the divine realm therefore signals boundary failure. The response is to reinforce separation, to reassert structure, to reimpose order where it has eroded. The tablets frequently describe rituals of cleansing following periods of disorder. These rituals are not merely symbolic acts to appease offended gods. They are corrective procedures. They restore conditions necessary for divine comfort. Comfort is not indulgence, it is operational. A god who is uncomfortable cannot govern effectively. Discomfort impairs judgment. Fatigue increases error. Illness threatens stability. The Sumerian worldview does not shy away from this implication. Gods are powerful, but they are not immune to consequence. They exist within a system that responds to strain. This understanding explains why divine anger is often followed by regret or negotiation. After a drastic action, balance must be restored again. The gods reassess. They adjust. They implement new rules to prevent recurrence. The flood narrative exemplifies this cycle. Discomfort leads to destruction. Destruction leads to loss. Loss creates new discomfort. The gods then revise their approach. Lifespans are shortened. Fertility is controlled. New limits are established. These revisions are not admissions of error in a moral sense. They are system updates. The Anunnaki function as administrators, refining governance based on outcomes. Illness and discomfort thus serve as feedback mechanisms. They inform decision-making. They signal when thresholds have been crossed. The tablets also preserve references to divine healing. Gods restore themselves. They seek relief. They re-establish calm. Healing is not miraculous reversal. It is the result of corrected conditions. Silence follows noise. Order follows chaos. Rest follows labour. These sequences are consistent. The Anunnaki's well-being improves when balance returns. This cyclical model contrasts sharply with later notions of divine perfection. In the Sumerian framework, perfection is not static flawlessness. It is dynamic balance. A perfect system adjusts, it responds, it corrects. The Anunnaki embody this principle. Their authority is expressed through maintenance of balance, not through invulnerability. The presence of illness also humanizes the gods without diminishing their role. It makes their actions comprehensible. They act not because they are cruel, but because they are strained. This does not excuse suffering, but it contextualizes it. Context matters. Without it, divine actions appear arbitrary. With it, they appear systemic. The tablets consistently emphasize system over sentiment. Even emotional language serves functional ends. Anger motivates correction. Fatigue motivates delegation. Discomfort motivates restructuring. The Anunnaki's participation in these processes underscores their integration into the world they govern. They are not outside observers, they are affected stakeholders. This stakeholder role explains why divine withdrawal is treated as dangerous. When gods withdraw due to discomfort, oversight diminishes, chaos increases, humans suffer. The relationship must be repaired. Repair requires effort on both sides. Humans reduce noise, they perform cleansing rituals, they restore offerings. The gods respond by returning presence. Balance resumes. This reciprocal repair reinforces the idea that order is fragile. It must be actively maintained. Neglect accumulates consequences. Illness is one such consequence. It is a signal that maintenance has failed. The Anunnaki's sensitivity to disorder also explains their intolerance for excess. Excess labour, excess population, excess noise, excess ritual even, when it becomes performative rather than corrective. Excess creates strain. Strain leads to breakdown. The tablets show that divine patience has limits. Those limits are not moral thresholds. They are capacity thresholds. Capacity thresholds are crossed slowly. The response appears sudden only because accumulation is invisible until it is too late. This invisibility explains why warnings are often ignored. Noise increases gradually, cities grow incrementally, each step seems manageable. Only in hindsight does the scale become apparent. The gods experience this accumulation as discomfort. Humans experience it as prosperity. This mismatch creates tension. The Anunnaki's role is to resolve that tension. Resolution often involves loss. Loss restores balance, but at cost. The cost is acknowledged in the texts. Gods mourn, they regret, they argue. These reactions reinforce that suffering is not desired, it is endured. The need for order is therefore not ideological, it is existential. Without order, the system harms everyone involved, divine and human alike. This shared vulnerability is central to the Sumerian worldview. It binds gods and humans into a single fate. Different roles, shared consequences. The Anunnaki, as enforcers of order, must sometimes impose painful measures, but those measures are framed as responses to discomfort, not expressions of dominance. Dominance without constraint would not require such careful calibration. The presence of calibration indicates limits. Limits define the Anunnaki's daily life. They monitor conditions. They tolerate strain. They intervene when necessary. They reassess outcomes. This process never ends. Balance is temporary. Disorder returns, correction follows. The cycle continues. As the narrative progresses, we will see how repeated cycles of discomfort and correction lead to increasing distance between gods and humans. Management replaces proximity, systems become more rigid. But at this stage, the connection remains close. The gods still feel discomfort directly. Illness still affects governance. Order is still personal. Nothing here reaches a final solution. Order must be renewed continuously. The Anunnaki remain engaged in this work, responding to strain not as distant tyrants, but as participants bound to the same fragile system they are tasked with preserving. When the Sumerian tablets speak about time, they do not treat it as a neutral backdrop against which events simply occur. Time is active. It shapes obligation. It accumulates consequence. It measures strain. For the gods, and especially for the Anunnaki, time is not something they stand outside of. It is something they must manage, endure, and respond to. This is one of the most important differences between the Sumerian worldview and later ideas of timeless divinity. The gods of the tablets do not exist in a frozen, eternal present. They experience duration. They remember what came before. They anticipate what may come next. Their decisions are shaped by what has already happened and by how long conditions have persisted. The texts reflect this awareness constantly, though rarely explicitly. They count reigns. They record generations. They measure intervals between events. They mark cycles. None of this would matter if time were irrelevant to divine existence. It matters precisely because the gods operate within it. The Anunnaki, as figures associated with fate and judgment, are particularly bound to time. Fate is not a single moment. It unfolds. Judgment is not instantaneous. It is delayed, reconsidered, sometimes revised. These processes require temporal depth. A decision made today must be lived with tomorrow. The tablets repeatedly show gods waiting for offerings to resume, waiting for humans to correct behavior, waiting for conditions to improve. Waiting is not passive. It is a form of restraint. Restraint requires awareness of time passing. This awareness shapes divine patience. Patience is not infinite. It has thresholds. Those thresholds are temporal. How long has the noise continued? How many seasons has neglect persisted? How many generations has imbalance been tolerated? These questions appear implicitly in divine deliberation. The flood narrative again illustrates this clearly. Humanity does not provoke destruction immediately. Noise increases over time, cities expand, activity intensifies. The gods attempt multiple responses before catastrophe occurs. Time passes between each attempt. The final decision is framed as the end of tolerance, not the beginning of anger. This framing shows that time functions as a measuring tool. It quantifies strain. Short disruptions can be endured, long disruptions cannot. The Anunnaki's role includes deciding when duration itself becomes dangerous. The importance of time also appears in the way decrees are framed. Decrees are not always permanent. Some are temporary, some are conditional, some are meant to last until circumstances change. This conditionality assumes a future in which conditions differ from the present. The gods therefore think in terms of sequence rather than absolutes. They do not simply impose rules forever, they adjust them. Adjustment requires time. The tablets also preserve genealogies of gods that span long periods. These genealogies are not ornamental. They situate divine figures within temporal continuity. A god inherits a role. Authority passes. Responsibilities shift. Even divine hierarchies evolve. The Anunnaki themselves are counted. They are listed. They belong to a generation. This generational thinking implies that divine order is not static. It develops. This development does not mean decay, but it does mean change. Roles expand. Responsibilities increase. Systems grow more complex. Complexity increases strain. Time magnifies everything. Noise becomes louder over centuries. Cities become denser. Labor becomes heavier. The gods feel this accumulation because they remain present long enough to feel it. The concept of divine fatigue is inseparable from time. Fatigue does not arise from a single action. It arises from repetition, from doing the same thing too long without sufficient relief. The Anunnaki's fatigue is therefore temporal in nature. This temporal fatigue explains why the gods seek delegation. Delegation reduces daily burden, but it also creates distance. Distance increases over time. Presence becomes less direct. The tablets reflect this gradual shift. Early texts imply close involvement. Later texts show more mediation, more ritual, more hierarchy. This is not sudden withdrawal, it is slow adjustment. Time also governs ritual. Rituals must be performed at the right moment. Too early or too late is dangerous. Timing matters because the gods are attentive to sequence. An offering given at the wrong time disrupts order rather than restoring it. This sensitivity to timing suggests that the gods are not merely symbolic recipients of ritual. They are active participants who experience events in sequence. They notice when something happens too late. Calendars therefore become sacred tools. They align human action with divine expectation. Alignment reduces friction. Misalignment produces discomfort. The Anunnaki's authority depends on this alignment. They do not force compliance instantly. They allow time for correction. But allowance is not infinite. Time also shapes memory. The gods remember past transgressions. They remember past loyalty. Memory informs judgment. Judgment informed by memory is more complex than immediate reaction. The tablets often reference ancient decisions still binding the present. Oaths sworn generations ago remain valid. Curses endure, blessings persist. This persistence implies divine memory across time. Memory also creates burden. To remember is to carry history. History weighs on decision-making. The Anunnaki's role as keepers of fate includes carrying this weight. This weight explains why divine councils revisit old issues. They reassess earlier choices in light of new developments. Reassessment requires temporal awareness. The underworld again provides insight. Souls are judged not only on isolated actions, but on life trajectories. Life unfolds over time. Judgment reflects accumulation, not momentary behavior. The Anunnaki's involvement in this process binds them to temporal narratives. They must know what came before to decide what comes after. This temporal binding also explains why the gods are concerned with repetition. Repeated failure is worse than singular failure. Repeated noise is worse than occasional noise. Repetition indicates systemic problem. Systemic problems cannot be solved instantly. They require structural change. Structural change takes time. The gods' solutions therefore increasingly involve long-term adjustments, shortening lifespans, limiting fertility, establishing new boundaries. These are not immediate punishments. They are future-oriented policies. Policy implies planning. Planning implies time. The Sumerian gods are planners. They anticipate outcomes. They attempt to prevent recurrence. Prevention operates over duration. This planning further distances them from ideas of impulsive divinity. The Anunnaki are not creatures of momentary rage. They are administrators managing long arcs of consequence. Time also matters because it creates scarcity. Resources deplete over time. Attention wanes. Patience erodes. The gods feel these pressures because they remain engaged. Engagement over time produces fatigue. Fatigue leads to delegation. Delegation leads to abstraction. This progression is gradual. The tablets capture this gradualness by avoiding sharp transitions. They do not announce that gods have changed. They simply show changes happening. This subtlety reflects lived experience. Change rarely feels dramatic while it occurs. It is recognized later. The Anunnaki live within this subtle change. Their daily life is shaped by the passage of time as much as by immediate conditions. Time also governs authority. Authority built over time is stronger than authority asserted once. The god's authority is ancient. It accumulates through continued presence. This accumulated authority allows restraint. A ruler who has ruled long can afford patience. A new ruler often cannot. The The Anunnaki's long presence enables measured response, but long presence also increases expectation. The longer the gods remain, the more they are expected to solve. Expectation adds pressure. Pressure accumulates. Time amplifies it. The tablets suggest that eventually this pressure becomes too great. Presence becomes burdensome. Management replaces involvement. Distance increases. But at this point in the narrative, time still binds gods and humans closely. The gods feel its weight directly. They are still counting seasons. The world they govern is not timeless. It ages. It grows. It strains. The gods age with it, not biologically perhaps, but administratively. This administrative aging shapes divine behaviour. Solutions become less personal. Systems become more rigid. Yet the awareness of time never disappears. It remains central to judgment, to fate, to order. Time matters because it reveals patterns. Patterns guide decisions. Decisions shape futures. The Anunnaki's daily life unfolds within this awareness. They are not acting in isolated moments. They are responding to histories. Nothing here concludes because time does not stop. It continues to pass. Conditions change. New strains appear. The gods remain attentive to this passage, measuring, tolerating, responding. As long as time flows, order requires management. And as long as order requires management, the Anunnaki remain bound to time, not above it, living within the slow accumulation of consequence that defines the world they inhabit. At first, staying is not a burden. In the earliest layers of the Sumerian record, divine presence appears stable, expected, and largely unproblematic. The Anunnaki reside within the world, oversee its functions, and participate in its rhythms without visible strain. Their presence feels natural, even necessary. But as the tablets accumulate, as time stretches across generations and systems grow more complex, a quiet pressure begins to emerge. It is not announced. It is not dramatized. It is felt. The weight of staying does not arrive suddenly. It builds. It settles into routines. It hides within repetition. The gods do not complain immediately. They tolerate. They adapt. They adjust expectations. This tolerance is itself evidence of long-term presence. Only those who remain long enough experience the slow accumulation of strain. The Sumerian worldview recognizes this accumulation implicitly. Cities expand. Populations increase. Labor intensifies. Administrative complexity grows. Each of these developments demands more oversight, more judgment, more attention. The Anunnaki remain present throughout this growth. Their responsibilities do not remain static. They expand with the world they govern. What begins as manageable oversight gradually becomes constant engagement. What was once periodic intervention becomes routine mediation. The gods find themselves responding more often, listening longer, correcting more frequently. This increase is not framed as failure. It is framed as consequence. A world that grows demands more from those who maintain it. The tablets reflect this through subtle shifts in tone. Early texts assume divine availability. Later texts emphasize divine patience. Patience is required when demands increase. It is a response to pressure, not its absence. Noise becomes louder not because humans suddenly change, but because there are more of them. Cities are more crowded, nights are less quiet, activities overlap. The gods' earlier tolerance is tested not by a single offence, but by sustained density. This density affects everything. Offerings multiply, increasing logistical burden. Disputes increase, increasing judicial workload. Rituals become more frequent, increasing demand for attention. The Anunnaki remain involved in all of this. Staying means absorbing the consequences of growth. The concept of too long is not moral, it is operational. Systems designed for one scale struggle at another. The gods are not overwhelmed because they lack power. They are strained because the system they oversee has outgrown its original balance. This strain is compounded by memory. The longer the gods remain, the more history they carry. Past decisions constrain present options. Decrees issued long ago still apply. Exceptions made once become precedents. Precedents multiply obligations. The Anunnaki, as keepers of fate, cannot forget. Forgetting would dissolve order. Memory binds them to continuity. Continuity binds them to accumulation. Accumulation creates weight. This weight expresses itself in irritation, fatigue, and eventual withdrawal. But withdrawal does not begin as departure. It begins as distance. Less direct involvement, more reliance on intermediaries, more formalization. The tablets hint at this shift by increasing emphasis on priests, rituals, and laws. These structures absorb some of the burden. They allow the gods to remain present without being constantly engaged. Presence becomes less immediate. This distancing is not abandonment, it is adaptation. Staying too long without adaptation would collapse the system. The gods adjust to preserve it. The Anunnaki's gradual withdrawal from daily involvement reflects this adaptive strategy. They do not leave the world. They step back from its constant noise. They manage rather than participate. Management reduces strain but introduces new problems. Distance creates misunderstanding. Ritual replaces familiarity. Authority becomes more rigid. These changes are not ideal, but they are necessary. The tablets do not celebrate this shift. They document it. Documentation implies inevitability rather than choice. The gods' tolerance has limits. Those limits are reached not because humans offend divinity, but because sustained presence becomes unsustainable. The world has grown louder, denser, heavier. Staying too long binds gods to outcomes they cannot fully control. Human behavior becomes less predictable. Systems strain under scale. The cost of intervention rises. At this point, force becomes tempting, but force solves nothing long-term. It resets conditions temporarily, but staying resumes afterward. The weight returns. The flood narrative can be understood in this context. It is not an expression of divine impatience alone. It is a release valve, a drastic reduction of load, a way to reset density. Even after the flood, the gods do not return to earlier closeness. New limits are instituted to prevent recurrence. Lifespans shorten. Fertility is controlled. These measures reduce future accumulation. The Anunnaki's role shifts further toward administration. Direct presence becomes rarer. The system becomes more self-regulating. This shift is not framed as loss of power. It is framed as preservation of function. Power that remains too close to a growing system risks being consumed by it. The gradual weight of staying too long also affects divine relationships. Disagreements increase. Councils become more contentious. Responsibility is redistributed. Hierarchies solidify. Solidification is another sign of strain. Flexible systems adapt easily. Rigid systems form under pressure. The divine order becomes more defined as demands increase. The Anunnaki, once deeply embedded in daily life, begin to occupy more abstract roles. Fate, judgment, decree. These roles allow distance. They reduce exposure to noise. This abstraction marks a turning point. The gods are still present, but differently. Their daily life becomes less about responding to immediate conditions and more about maintaining overarching structure. The tablets reflect this by shifting focus from daily interaction to institutional continuity. Temples matter more than cities. Ritual matters more than conversation. Law matters more than appeal. These changes are subtle. They unfold over time. They're rarely announced. The weight of staying too long also reshapes divine emotion. Frustration replaces curiosity. Fatigue replaces engagement. Concern replaces closeness. These emotional shifts do not diminish authority. They transform it. Authority becomes less personal, more procedural. Procedure protects gods from overload. It also protects humans from unpredictability. The relationship becomes more stable, but less intimate. The Anunnaki accept this trade-off because the alternative is collapse. Staying exactly as before would eventually destroy the system they govern. The tablets do not frame this adaptation as regret. They frame it as necessity. Necessity is a recurring theme. The gods act not because they wish to, but because conditions demand it. Staying too long without change creates unbearable strain. The concept of too long therefore marks a threshold, not a moral failure, a structural limit. Once that limit is reached, withdrawal begins, not as escape, but as reconfiguration. This reconfiguration will continue to shape everything that follows. Presence becomes symbolic, interaction becomes mediated, authority becomes distant. But here, in this moment, the weight is just becoming noticeable. The gods are still close enough to feel it directly. They are still deciding how to respond. Nothing resolves yet. The system has not fully changed. The weight continues to increase. Adaptation is underway but incomplete. The Anunnaki remain, carrying the accumulated burden of time, memory, responsibility and proximity. Staying has worked until now, but the cost of staying grows heavier with every generation, and that growing weight quietly sets the stage for what comes next. The shift does not announce itself. There is no single decree, no dramatic withdrawal, no clear boundary where presence ends and distance begins. Instead, the Sumerian tablets suggest a gradual transition, one shaped by necessity rather than choice. Management replaces daily involvement not because the Anunnaki lose authority, but because authority exercised through constant presence becomes unsustainable. At first, involvement is direct. The gods attend to matters as they arise. They hear complaints, they respond to disturbances, they intervene in disputes. This mode of governance depends on proximity. It assumes that the gods are close enough to feel problems as they develop. But as the world grows denser, as populations expand and systems multiply, the volume of issues increases beyond what direct involvement can handle. Management emerges as a solution to overload. Rather than responding to every disturbance, the gods establish frameworks that regulate behavior in advance. Laws are formalized, ritual schedules are standardized, roles are clearly defined. These systems reduce the need for constant divine attention. The tablets reflect this change through increasing emphasis on procedure. What was once handled through situational judgment becomes governed by rule. This does not eliminate judgment, but it constrains it. Decisions are made within frameworks rather than reinvented each time. This shift mirrors human administration. A small household can be managed informally. A large city requires bureaucracy. The gods adapt to scale in the same way humans do. Their governance becomes institutional. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and decree, are central to this transformation. Fate becomes less about moment-to-moment intervention and more about established limits. Lifespans are fixed. Boundaries between realms are codified. Consequences follow patterns rather than improvisation. This patterning reduces strain. When outcomes are predictable, attention can be distributed more efficiently. The gods no longer need to monitor every action. Systems self-regulate within defined parameters. The rise of intermediaries reflects this logic. Priests interpret omens, kings enforce laws, judges apply precedent. Each intermediary absorbs a portion of the god's former workload. Divine presence remains, but it is filtered. Filtering creates distance, but also stability. Humans know what is expected without needing constant divine clarification. This predictability allows societies to function at larger scales. The tablets increasingly record roles rather than actions. Lists replace narratives. Offices replace personalities. This administrative tone signals a world where management has become the dominant mode of governance. Divine councils still meet, but their focus shifts. Rather than responding to individual disturbances, they assess systemic trends. population, noise, resource strain. Their decisions shape long-term policy rather than immediate response. This long-term orientation is characteristic of management. It sacrifices immediacy for sustainability. The Anunnaki's daily life changes accordingly. They spend less time reacting and more time overseeing, less time among streets and more time within frameworks. Their presence becomes less sensory, more structural. Structural presence is harder to perceive, but more enduring. A law outlasts a conversation. A ritual outlasts a warning. The gods embed themselves in these structures to reduce the burden of constant engagement. This embedding also protects them. Distance shields the gods from noise, from endless appeals, from the accumulation of minor grievances. It preserves their capacity to intervene when necessary. Intervention does not disappear. It becomes rarer and more consequential. When gods act directly, it is because systems have failed. Direct involvement becomes exceptional rather than routine. The flood narrative again provides context. After catastrophe, the gods do not return to previous closeness. They impose new limits designed to prevent recurrence. These limits are management tools. They reduce future strain without requiring constant oversight. The Anunnaki's authority is thus preserved through abstraction. They are less visible, but more entrenched. Their will is expressed through law, custom, and fate rather than through conversation. This abstraction changes the texture of divine-human relationship. Intimacy decreases. Predictability increases. Humans interact more with institutions than with gods themselves. The tablets reflect this change without lament. It is presented as evolution, not loss. The system adapts to scale. However, this adaptation has consequences. Distance creates misunderstanding. Ritual becomes mechanical. Authority feels impersonal. These tensions appear later in lamentations and prayers seeking renewed presence. At this stage, though, management is still new. The gods are adjusting. They have not fully withdrawn. They are learning how to govern without constant proximity. The Anunnaki remain engaged, but differently. Their attention is strategic rather than reactive. They monitor thresholds rather than details. This monitoring still requires awareness of time. Trends unfold slowly. Management depends on patience. Decisions are evaluated over generations. The gods' fatigue decreases as involvement decreases. But fatigue does not vanish. Management has its own costs. Bureaucracy generates complexity. Complexity generates new strain. The tablets hint at this by increasing concern with correctness, errors in ritual, deviations from law, misinterpretation of omens. These errors require correction. Correction remains a divine responsibility. Management does not eliminate accountability. It redistributes it. The Anunnaki's role becomes one of calibration, adjusting limits, revising rules, refining systems. This work is quieter than direct intervention, but no less demanding. The shift from involvement to management also affects divine identity. Gods become defined by domains rather than by actions. Titles replace stories. Functions replace presence. This functional identity allows continuity even as individuals fade. The system persists regardless of which god occupies which role. The tablets increasingly emphasize this continuity. Names matter less than offices. Fate continues even as actors change. This impersonality marks a significant transformation. Divine life becomes less about living among humans and more about sustaining systems humans live within. The Anunnaki accept this transformation because it allows the world to continue without exhausting its overseers. It is a compromise between presence and absence. This compromise is not final. It will continue to evolve. Distance will increase further. Memory will replace experience. But here, at this point, management has just begun to replace daily involvement. The gods are still close enough to intervene, but far enough to rest. The weight of staying too long has forced adaptation. The system survives because of it. Nothing concludes yet. The transition is ongoing. Management stabilizes the present but reshapes the future. The Anunnaki remain at the center of this process, no longer walking the streets each day, but still holding the framework together through attention that has become quieter, broader, and more distant than before. The withdrawal does not resemble an exit. There are no closing words, no final gestures, no announcement that presence is ending. The Sumerian tablets instead suggest something quieter, more gradual and far more ambiguous. Ordinary life continues. Cities remain inhabited. Temples remain active. Rituals proceed as they always have. And yet something shifts. The Anunnaki are still acknowledged, still invoked, still counted, but their closeness to everyday experience begins to thin. This thinning is not framed as abandonment. It is framed as absence without disappearance. The gods are still part of the world, but they are no longer woven into its smallest movements. They no longer attend every disturbance. They no longer respond to every complaint. Their involvement becomes less tactile, less immediate. The tablets reflect this change through what they stop describing. Earlier texts imply frequent interaction, direct response, and shared space. Later material assumes divine oversight without illustrating it. Presence becomes inferred rather than observed. Inference replaces experience. This shift matters because it changes how humans relate to the gods. When presence is direct, relationship is personal. When presence becomes inferred, relationship becomes procedural. Humans continue to act as though the gods are present, but fewer moments confirm that presence directly. The Anunnaki's withdrawal from ordinary life follows this pattern. They do not retreat into an unreachable realm. They retreat from constant exposure, from noise, from repetition, from the unending demands of growing societies. Withdrawal, in this sense, is protective. It preserves divine capacity by limiting contact. It does not eliminate responsibility. It reframes it. The tablets suggest that divine attention narrows to thresholds rather than details. The gods intervene when systems approach failure, not when minor disruptions occur. This selective attention reduces strain. Ordinary life, meanwhile, becomes increasingly human-managed. Kings rule, priests administer, judges arbitrate. The divine presence legitimizes these roles but does not micromanage them. This delegation creates a buffer. Humans no longer expect immediate divine reaction to everyday events. They rely on institutions instead. The Anunnaki remain the ultimate authority, but they are no longer the first point of contact. This layered distance changes tone. Divine anger becomes less frequent but more consequential. When the gods do act, it feels heavier because it is rarer. Silence becomes meaningful. In earlier periods, silence might indicate rest or momentary withdrawal. Now it stretches longer. The absence of response becomes normal rather than alarming. The tablets do not interpret this silence as failure. They interpret it as order functioning properly. A system that requires constant correction is unstable. A system that runs quietly is healthy. The gods withdraw from ordinary life because ordinary life no longer requires their constant presence. Structures now absorb much of the work that presence once performed. This does not mean the gods are less powerful. It means their power has become infrastructural. Infrastructure is invisible until it fails. The Anunnaki's authority now resides in calendars, laws, boundaries, and fates, rather than in daily appearances. Humans interact with these structures constantly, even if they rarely encounter the gods themselves. This transformation alters religious expression. Ritual becomes more formal. Prayer becomes more scripted. Appeal becomes less conversational. These changes reflect adaptation, not decline. The gods still hear, but they do not always answer immediately. They still judge, but they do so through established channels. They still exist within time, but they experience it differently. The withdrawal from ordinary life also reduces emotional volatility. Constant interaction produces constant friction. Distance smooths tension. The tablets suggest fewer divine outbursts as management solidifies. When outbursts occur, they are responses to systemic failure rather than irritation. This restraint reflects learning. The gods have discovered that constant proximity creates unsustainable strain. Withdrawal restores balance, yet withdrawal also introduces risk. Distance can lead to misunderstanding. Humans may misinterpret silence. Institutions may drift from intention. Ritual may become empty repetition. These risks are acknowledged implicitly. Lamentations arise when cities fall. Prayers seek renewed attention. The desire for presence does not vanish. But the gods do not return to ordinary life in the same way. Once withdrawn, full return would undo the adaptation. The Anunnaki therefore maintain a careful distance, close enough to sustain order, far enough to endure. This balance is delicate. Too much distance invites chaos. Too much closeness invites exhaustion. The tablets portray the gods as continually adjusting this balance. Withdrawal is not final, it is modulated. Ordinary life continues without constant divine interruption. Humans take on more responsibility. They manage more of their own affairs. This shift changes identity. Humans become agents rather than dependents. The gods become frameworks rather than companions. The Anunnaki accept this evolution because it preserves continuity. A world that depends entirely on divine presence cannot scale. A world supported by systems can. The quietness of withdrawal is intentional. A dramatic departure would destabilize belief. Gradual absence allows adaptation. Nothing breaks suddenly. Life goes on. This continuity is essential. The gods do not want to be remembered as having left. They want to be understood as having changed how they are present. Presence through order rather than through interaction. The tablets reflect this by continuing to list gods even when stories about them diminish. Names remain. Roles remain. Activity fades. Memory replaces experience. This replacement is not loss alone. It is transformation. Memory allows permanence where presence would exhaust. The Anunnaki become part of the world's background structure. They are no longer encountered in streets or dreams as frequently, but their influence persists. This persistence is quiet. It does not demand attention. The quiet withdrawal from ordinary life is therefore not disappearance. It is a reconfiguration of presence to ensure survival of the system. The gods remain, but differently. Less visible, less engaged, more distant. The world adjusts. Nothing concludes here. Withdrawal continues gradually. Systems strengthen. Distance increases. The Anunnaki are still there, no longer woven into every moment, but still holding the architecture of order together, just beyond the reach of ordinary life where silence replaces conversation and structure replaces familiarity. If the Sumerian tablets are taken seriously on their own terms, without rushing to modern conclusions or forcing them into familiar categories, they leave us with a picture that is quieter than expected. Not lesser, not diminished, simply quieter. The Anunnaki do not appear as beings who exist only in moments of crisis or revelation. They appear as beings whose lives unfolded through repetition, obligation, adjustment, and restraint. In other words, through routine. This idea unsettles because routine feels ordinary, and we are accustomed to thinking of gods as anything but that. Yet the tablets do not seem troubled by this ordinariness. They record it calmly. They assume it. The gods eat, rest, govern, withdraw, return attention, and set limits. None of this is framed as extraordinary. It is framed as necessary. If the gods had routines, then divinity in the Sumerian world was not defined by constant transcendence. It was defined by sustained presence within structure. Power did not remove the need for rhythm. Authority did not eliminate fatigue. Presence did not negate time. Routine is what allows systems to endure. A single act can establish something, but only repetition keeps it alive. The tablets suggest that the Anunnaki understood this deeply, not as philosophers, but as administrators of reality. Their days were not filled with spectacle, they were filled with maintenance. Maintenance rarely attracts attention. It happens quietly. When it succeeds, nothing dramatic occurs. The world continues. This continuation is itself the result. If gods had routines, then their authority was exercised not through constant force, but through constancy. Not through interruption, but through reliability. The Anunnaki mattered not because they appeared, but because they stayed long enough for their presence to shape expectations. This framing also changes how we understand their eventual distance. Withdrawal is no longer a mystery or betrayal. It is the result of routine carried too long without relief. Any system that demands endless attention eventually exhausts those who sustain it. The gods did not leave because they failed. They stepped back because staying unchanged would have broken the system entirely. Management replaced presence. Memory replaced familiarity. Structure replaced interaction. If the gods had routines, then humans were not merely subjects. They were participants in shared rhythms. Offerings, silence, labour, restraint. These were not acts of worship alone. They were acts of alignment. Alignment matters when routines exist. Disruption accumulates when alignment fails. The tablets show this repeatedly. Noise grows, balance falters, correction follows. This pattern is not moral storytelling. It is systems thinking. Seen this way, the Anunnaki are not distant myths. They are figures embedded in a worldview that understands reality as something that must be managed continuously. Their divinity lies not in exemption from consequence, but in responsibility for it. If gods had routines, then time mattered to them. Fatigue mattered, rest mattered, distance mattered. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of limitation within power. Limitation gives power shape. Without limits, power dissolves into chaos. The Sumerian gods are powerful because they accept constraint. This acceptance makes their actions comprehensible. It explains their patience, their frustration, their restraint, and their eventual withdrawal. It explains why presence becomes quieter rather than ending. The tablets never say the gods vanished. They say less and less about them directly. Silence grows not because the gods are gone, but because their presence has become structural rather than conversational. If gods had routines, then the world did not rely on constant miracles to function. It relied on order sustained quietly over time. That order could persist even as presence faded. This persistence is what remains. As the lamps dim and attention softens, there is no need to resolve what the Anunnaki ultimately were. The tablets do not ask us to decide that. They ask us to notice how the world they describe operates. A world where even gods must rest. A world where authority grows through presence. A world where staying too long creates strain. A world where withdrawal is not disappearance, but adaptation. If gods had routines, then perhaps the most powerful thing they ever did was not to arrive or to depart, but to remain long enough for the world to learn how to continue without them being close. And if that is so, then the quietness that follows is not emptiness. It is structure doing its work. You do not hear it when it functions well. It simply holds. And as rest comes, and the weight of the day loosens, there is no need to carry this any further. The patterns continue whether we watch them or not. That was always their purpose. The world settles, the routines persist, the silence remains, not as absence, but as balance.